The body had been dead for 6 minutes when Scabrous turned the page. He did not look up. The scratch of his stylus against the data slate continued, at the same pace it had maintained for the past hour. Steady, unhurried. The sound of a man recording observations about weather patterns or crop yields, not about the cooling corpse 3 meters from his feet. The acolyte had been 19 years old. Scabrous noted this in the margin, not out of sentiment. Age was a variable. Variables were recorded. He finished the page. He set the stylus down. Only then did he stand and walk to the body, crouching beside it with the careful movement of a man whose knees had begun to register the cold, and examine what the last 4 minutes of the young man's life had done to him. It was not pleasant to look at. Scabrous looked at it for a long time. Then he stood, returned to his desk, picked up the stylus, and kept writing. Outside the tower, the frozen world of Odessa Faustin was doing what it always did. Nothing. The wind moved across the ice fields in long, directionless sweeps. The sky sat low and colourless above the Academy's stone buildings. The same sky it had been yesterday. The same sky it would be tomorrow. Below the tower's single narrow window, students moved between structures in the cold, their dark robes pulled close, their breath visible for a moment before the wind took it. None of them looked up at the tower. They had learned, in the particular way that people learn things in dangerous institutions, that looking up at the tower was not something that improved your situation. The tower belonged to the headmaster. The headmaster was not to be observed. This understanding had settled into the Academy's population within 3 months of Scabrous's arrival 15 years ago, without anyone stating it directly. It was the kind of knowledge that moved through a group of force sensitives without words. A pressure, a quality in the air around certain subjects, a shared awareness that some doors were not doors in the ordinary sense. The tower was not a door in the ordinary sense. Scabrous had chosen this world himself. That was the first thing to understand about him. The Sith Empire had offered him 3 postings when he completed his own training. A position on Drummond Cars in the Imperial Academy system, a research appointment at a well-funded alchemical institute on Zeost, and this, the headmaster position at a remote, underfunded, academically unremarkable institution on a frozen outer rim world that produced competent but not exceptional Sith graduates and had not generated a notable alumnus in 60 years. He had taken the frozen world without hesitation. His superiors had noted the choice as eccentric. They had not questioned it. Eccentric Sith who asked for nothing and caused no political problems were low-priority concerns. Scabrous understood this. He had calculated it. What Odessa Faustin offered was not resources or prestige or proximity to power. It offered distance. Distance from oversight. Distance from colleagues who asked questions. Distance from the kind of institutional attention that accumulated around ambitious Sith doing ambitious work. And beneath the Academy's main library, in a sub-basement that appeared on no current architectural record, it offered something specific that no other posting in the Empire could have given him. It offered the archive. He had found it in his 2nd month, not by accident. Scabrous did very little by accident. He had known, from fragmentary references in 3 separate Sith alchemical texts he had studied during his training, that Odessa Faustin had been used by an ancient practitioner. The references were oblique, incomplete, the kind of citations that appeared in old texts when the author knew something significant, but chose not to record it fully. A world, a frozen place. Work done there that the author described only as the Deep Project. Twice in one text, once in another, never explained. The 3rd reference, in a commentary on Sith biological alchemy, written 4 centuries after the original work, named the practitioner, Darth Dreer. Scabrous had spent 2 years before his posting locating everything the Imperial Archives held on that name. It was not much. Dreer had been methodical about obscuring his work, not hiding it, exactly, but routing it through layers of indirect reference that required patience and cross-indexing to follow. Most scholars had not followed it. Scabrous had patience and was skilled at cross-indexing, and what he assembled, piece by piece over those 2 years, was the outline of something extraordinary, a formula for immortality. Not the vague theoretical immortality that Sith Lords discussed in abstract terms, not essence transfer or spirit preservation, or any of the partial, compromised approaches that the Sith had attempted and failed at for millennia. Something biological, something precise, something that worked through a living organism rather than through the Force directly. And that, Scabrous had understood immediately, was the reason no one had followed the reference trail. It did not look like Force scholarship. It looked like botany. Most Sith Lords were not interested in botany. Scabrous was interested in everything that intersected with the mechanisms of death. The sub-basement archive held 3 things of value. The first was a collection of Dreer's working notes, physical documents partially degraded, recording the early stages of his research in a cramped, precise hand that Scabrous spent 4 months learning to read fluently. The second was a set of biological specimens in various states of preservation, materials from Dreer's experiments, sealed in containers of old transparent steel, most of them no longer viable but intact enough to analyze. The third was the holocron. It sat at the back of a stone shelf, behind the specimen containers, in a recess that was not immediately visible when you entered the room. It was smaller than most Sith holocrons, palm-sized, the surface a dark reddish black that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, with no visible activation point. Scabrous had carried it up to his tower, set it on his workbench, and spent 11 days determining how to open it. On the 12th day it opened. What came out of it was Darth Dreer. Not his ghost, not his spirit, but his recorded voice and image, a reconstruction built from memories deposited over decades. The gatekeeper system Dreer had designed releasing information in sequence, as Scabrous demonstrated comprehension of each layer. The first layer took 3 months, the second took 6. The third, the core, the complete record, the final entry made in the vault on Odas Aphostin 8 days before Dreer's death, took 3 years to reach. By the time Scabrous heard Dreer's final recording, he understood the formula completely. He understood the orchid, the black-petaled Murakami specimen that Dreer had spent 40 years cultivating, engineering through Sith alchemy into a biological mechanism for delivering the immortality compound. He understood the ritual, the precise sequence of force channeling and alchemical preparation that would cause the plant to bloom in the right conditions, releasing the compound into the body of someone who had been chemically prepared to receive it. He understood the sickness. This was the part that most interested him, not because he feared it, but because Dreer's analysis of it was incomplete in ways that Scabrous could see clearly. Dreer had created the pathogen as an accidental byproduct of the bloom compound's engineering. In a partial bloom, petals opening only partway, compound released in insufficient concentration, the pathogen activated in its incomplete form and did what pathogens did. It spread, it transformed, it destroyed. Dreer had documented the results with clinical precision. What he had not fully solved was the containment threshold, the exact bloom completion percentage at which the compound neutralized the pathogen rather than releasing it. Scabrous had solved this in his first year of study. It was not a complicated calculation once you had Dreer's complete data. The threshold was 93% bloom completion. Below that, the pathogen activated. Above it, the compound neutralized everything. The ritual, performed correctly with the right caretaker, would reach full bloom without difficulty. The right caretaker was Dreer's unsolved problem, and it was, Scabrous had concluded after considerable analysis, the reason Dreer had died. Dreer had used a Sith acolyte. This was the error, not in the selection process. Dreer had been thorough. had chosen a genuinely Force-sensitive young practitioner with documented sensitivity to living organisms. The error was categorical. Sith training, regardless of the individual's natural attunement, shaped Force sensitivity in a specific direction. Aggressive, projecting, commanding. It was designed to move outward, to impose, to dominate the environment rather than receive from it. The orchid required the opposite. The plant was a Murakami orchid, a species with documented Force reactivity, well studied in certain Jedi agricultural circles, known for its responsiveness to the quality of Force presence in its environment. It did not respond to power or to dominance. It responded to attunement, the specific, passive, receptive relationship with living organisms that developed in Force sensitives, who spent years working with botanical specimens cooperatively rather than controlling them. In other words, not a Sith, a Jedi. Specifically, the kind of Jedi who ended up in the agricultural corps. The practitioners whose Force sensitivity expressed itself in gentle, living world attunement rather than combat or political aptitude. The ones the Jedi Order considered the least remarkable. The ones no one paid attention to. Scabrous had spent 3 years confirming this analysis from every available angle before accepting it completely, not because he doubted the conclusion, but because accepting it meant acquiring a Jedi. And acquiring a Jedi required a level of operational care that accepting a wrong conclusion would waste. The conclusion was correct. He needed a Jedi gardener. The body on the floor was not part of the immortality project. This was important to understand about Scabrous. He ran multiple research threads simultaneously. Had done so for his entire adult life because a single line of inquiry was inefficient and the waiting periods in any long-term project were better filled with parallel work than with patience for its own sake. The acolyte on the floor had been part of a separate study. The neurological effects of extended low-level dark side exposure on Force-sensitive subjects who were not aware they were being exposed. It was foundational research, the kind that would not produce results for another decade, but whose data would eventually inform the larger project's preparation protocols. The young man had simply reached the end of his usefulness to that particular thread. Scabrous had noted the moment, had felt the shift in the Force signature he had been monitoring, and had recorded it with the same attention he gave everything in this room. He crossed to the body now and crouched again, this time removing a small instrument from his coat pocket and taking 3 final measurements. The readings were consistent with his predictions. He recorded them. He stood. He pressed a panel near the door. 2 Academy maintenance workers appeared within 4 minutes. They had learned not to ask questions about the tower. They removed what needed to be removed. They left. Scabrous washed his hands at the basin near the window. The vessel was the next problem. Dria's original orchid container, the sealed durasteel housing he had built to preserve the plant in stasis, had left Odessa Forsten centuries ago. Scabrous had traced it through a chain of archive transfers, each one documented in imperial records under reference numbers that required patience and a working knowledge of 3 different cataloguing systems to follow. The trail ended at Dromund Kaas, the main imperial archive complex, lower collection, 3rd row. He had confirmed the location 2 years ago. Acquiring it was a matter of institutional navigation. Scabrous had no taste for institutional navigation, but he had a thorough understanding of how imperial bureaucracies processed classification requests. And he had spent the past 6 months building the documentation trail that would make his acquisition order appear routine. A research classification, a transfer authorization, the right stamps from the right offices, obtained through intermediaries who had no idea what they were authorizing. The paperwork was nearly complete. He dried his hands. He moved to the window. Below, the academy went about its afternoon. Students crossed the central courtyard in groups of 2 and 3. their training sabers at their belts, their faces carrying the particular closed expression that young Sith developed as a survival mechanism in their first year. Not blank, not afraid, but carefully neutral. The expression of people who had learned that showing the wrong thing at the wrong moment had consequences. An instructor moved between two sparring students on the far practice ground, correcting a stance with a shove rather than a word. Scabrous watched this without particular interest. The academy ran. It had always run. It would continue to run without his active management, because it was a machine. And machines ran on their own momentum, once properly configured. He had not built the machine. It had been here before him. But he had understood it quickly and adjusted 3 things in his first year that made it self-sustaining. The adjustments were subtle. No one had noticed them as deliberate. They simply experienced the academy as slightly more efficient than before and attributed it to the new headmaster's competence. The academy was not his work. The tower was his work. The sub-basement archive was his work. The 15 years of reconstruction and analysis and parallel research threads. All of it converging now on 2 remaining problems: the vessel and the caretaker. One was a matter of paperwork. The other was a matter of finding the right person on the right agricultural posting in the right sector of the Outer Rim without triggering a formal Jedi response that would bring investigators to this world before the ritual was complete. Both were solvable. Everything was solvable, given sufficient time and sufficient precision. He turned from the window. The tower room was quiet. The data slate on the desk, the workbench along the far wall, with its instruments and specimen containers, Dria's closed holocron in its housing on the shelf above. The cold came through the stone walls in the slow, permanent way of a world that had been frozen for longer than any recorded history. The lamp above the desk cast its steady light across the surface of everything and changed nothing. Scabrous sat at the desk. He opened a clean data slate. He began writing a letter to the administration office of the Drummond Cass Imperial Archive. A polite, formal, entirely unremarkable request for transfer authorization on a catalogued item, reference number included, institutional justification attached. The language of a scholar making a routine acquisition. The stylus moved at the same steady pace it always moved. Outside, the wind crossed the ice fields of Odassa Fostin in long directionless sweeps. The students below finished their afternoon training and moved inside. The courtyard emptied. The cold settled into the stone of the tower the way it settled into everything on this world. Completely, without effort, as though it had always been there and always would be. Scabrous wrote. He had been patient for 15 years. He could be patient a little longer. Rance Lusk had killed 2 people before breakfast. This was not unusual at Odassa Fostin. What was unusual was that he had done it quietly, without an audience, before the morning training period even began, which meant no one had seen it, which meant no rank credit, which meant the 2 deaths had cost him nothing, and gained him nothing in the institution's brutal arithmetic. He stood in the empty corridor outside the Eastern dormitory, and looked at what he had done, and felt the specific frustration of wasted effort. Then he felt something else, the sensation of being observed. He turned. The corridor was empty in both directions. The ceiling lamps burned at their low pre-dawn setting, casting long shadows against the stone walls. Nothing moved. But the feeling did not leave. Lusk had been at the academy for 3 years. He had learned in those 3 years to trust that particular sensation. The awareness of attention, the pressure of someone's focus landing on you from a direction you could not identify. In the academy's ecosystem, that feeling meant danger. It meant someone had seen what you did not want seen, or knew what you did not want known, or had decided that your continued existence was an inconvenience to theirs. He looked up, instinctively. The tower window, 3 buildings away across the central courtyard, was a pale rectangle in the pre-dawn dark. There was no figure in it. There was nothing there at all. Lusk turned and walked to the morning hall. Behind him in the corridor, the two bodies lay where they had fallen. Someone would find them. Someone always found them. It was one of the Academy's unspoken functions, the maintenance of surfaces, the removal of evidence, the institution's quiet metabolism processing what its population produced. He did not look back. The Odessa Fostin Sith Academy had existed for 200 years before Scabrous arrived. In that time, it had produced graduates of moderate distinction, functional Sith warriors, competent intelligence operatives, a handful of scholars, and had maintained its institutional existence through the simple mechanism of being useful enough to fund and unimportant enough to ignore. The Sith Empire had larger concerns than a remote academy, producing average results on a frozen world that appeared on no strategic map. It sent its budget allocation annually. It received its graduate reports. It did not visit. The Academy's internal structure had calcified across those 2 centuries into something that no longer required design to sustain itself. It ran on hierarchy, and hierarchy ran on violence. And violence ran on the specific terror of young Force sensitives placed in close proximity with each other, and told that only some of them would advance. The result was an institution that consumed its population at a steady rate and replaced them from the Empire's recruiting pipelines, and asked no difficult questions about the consumption. Scabrous had understood this within his first week. He had changed 3 things, as noted: small adjustments to resource allocation and scheduling that made the machine run more smoothly without altering its fundamental nature. And then he had left it alone. A running machine needed no attention. Attention was for the tower. The morning training period began at the 3rd hour. 41 acolytes assembled in the main practice hall, a high-ceilinged stone space with durasteel reinforcements on the walls and permanent scorch marks on the floor from decades of training saber work. The hall smelled of sweat and ozone, and the particular metallic cold of a building that was never fully warm. Instructor Shackweth ran the session. Shake was one of 4 instructors at the academy, and the one the students feared most purely on physical grounds. A broad-scarred Sith warrior whose teaching philosophy could be summarized as, if it hurts you enough times, you stop letting it hurt you. He moved through the assembled acolytes with the slow confidence of a predator that had learned nothing in the room could threaten it, correcting stances with shoves, redirecting lightsaber grips with sharp taps to the wrist, occasionally pulling 2 students into a live demonstration that left one of them on the floor. He did not glance at the tower. None of the instructors glanced at the tower during training sessions. This was another piece of unspoken knowledge. The headmaster observed when he chose to observe, and acknowledging that awareness was its own kind of vulnerability. Among the 41 students in the hall, 3 are relevant to understand this particular day. The first was Lusk. He was 19, lean in the way of someone who had been lean their whole life, and had added muscle to it through 3 years of training, with the kind of focused stillness that instructors either recognized as genuine Force sensitivity or mistook for arrogance. In his case, it was both. He was ranked 4th in the current cohort by the Academy's formal assessment system, which measured combat performance, Force application scores, and what the assessment rubric called institutional contribution, a category whose meaning everyone understood and no one stated directly. His rank had been 5th 2 days ago. The corridor this morning had moved him up 1 position. He worked through the morning session with the careful economy of someone conserving energy, doing enough to avoid Shackweth's corrective attention, not enough to draw competitive attention from the students ranked above him. He had learned this balance in his first year. The academy rewarded aggression at the right moments and punished it at the wrong ones, and distinguishing between those moments was itself a survival skill. What occupied the back of his thoughts through the entire session was not the training. It was the appointment. 3 days from now, at the 14th hour, he had been summoned to the tower. The second student was a girl named Kindra. She was 16, 2 years into her training, ranked somewhere in the middle of the cohort by every metric the academy used. Not remarkable enough to be targeted, not weak enough to be culled. Existing in the comfortable anonymity of the middle tier, where the pressure was lower and the life expectancy was higher. She was force sensitive in a way that her assessment scores did not fully capture. Her combat numbers were average, but her awareness scores were unusually high. The kind of peripheral force perception that did not express itself in duels, but in the constant, low-level reading of a room. She felt the session's undercurrents in real time. She felt Lusk's controlled tension from across the hall. The specific quality of someone moving through the present while thinking about the future. She felt Shakeweth's attention as a physical pressure that shifted and redirected as he moved among the students. And she felt, as she had felt every morning for the past 6 weeks, the faint distant quality of something she could not locate or name. A weight that seemed to come from the direction of the tower. Not always, not consistently, but present often enough that she had begun orienting toward it without meaning to. She had not told anyone about this. Telling people about things you noticed was how you became a target. The third student had no name the academy had recorded accurately. He had arrived 8 months ago under the designation Manah-Rat, a name from a species that named children differently than most, and had spent those 8 months in the lower cohort, struggling with force application exercises that his classmates found routine, surviving through a combination of physical toughness and the particular luck of the unremarkable. He was not ranked. Students who were not ranked did not appear on the assessment rubric's competitive tiers, which meant they were not targets in the direct sense. They were targets in a different sense. They were available. What Rat had that the academy did not assess, and therefore did not value, was patience. The deep, structural kind. Not the patience of someone waiting for an opportunity, but the patience of someone who had grown up in conditions where the present moment was all that was reliably available, and had learned to inhabit it completely. He moved through the morning session at his own pace. He did not look at the tower. He had never looked at the tower. Midday brought a break in the formal schedule. A 2-hour period that appeared in the academy's calendar as independent study and functioned in practice as the institution's most dangerous hours. Because unsupervised time in a population of competitive young Sith was not rest. It was a different kind of pressure. Kindra spent the midday period in the library's upper reading room, one of the few spaces in the academy where the ambient tension ran lower, because the students who used it were primarily interested in study rather than rank, and the intersection between academic ambition and violent ambition was narrower than the intersection between combat ambition and violent ambition. She was reading a text on force resonance theory when the door opened and Lusk came in. He did not look at her. He moved to the far table, set down a data slate, and began working through something she could not see from her position. His body language was the closed, contained posture of someone who did not want to be spoken to. She did not speak to him, but her force awareness registered what his posture was masking, not calmly. The quality of his focus had an edge to it that she had not felt from him before. Not fear, exactly. Something adjacent to it. The specific unease of someone who had been given information they did not know what to do with. She kept reading. Across the room, Lusk stared at his data slate and did not read anything on it. 3 days until the tower. The afternoon brought combat assessments. These were formal, scored events. Pairs of students assigned by the ranking system, fighting with training sabers in the assessment hall, while Shackweth and 2 other instructors observed and recorded. The scores fed directly into the cohort rankings. A strong assessment could move a student up 2 or 3 positions. A poor one, or a loss, could move them down far enough to attract the wrong kind of attention. Ra was paired against a third-year student, ranked 8 positions above him. The result was not competitive. What was notable, to Kindra, watching from the observation tier, and to no one else, was that Ra'at did not fight with the frantic energy of someone trying to win against a superior opponent. He fought with the same steady patience that characterized everything he did, absorbing the assessment's punishment without the panic or anger that the situation would have produced in most students. He lost quickly. He stood up. He walked to the side of the hall and sat down and watched the next pair with the same attention he had given to everything else today. Sheikh Weth did not record Rat's score with any special emphasis. The unremarkable were unremarkable in defeat, as in everything. At the 16th hour, as the light outside the Academy's narrow windows shifted to the grey-white of Odessa Fostin's brief twilight, Shackweth dismissed the day's final session. The students moved through the corridors toward the dining hall in the loose, wary groupings that had become habitual. Never alone if avoidable, never in groups large enough to appear threatening to a larger group. The constant social calculation of the Academy's population, working at the level of reflex. Lusk ate alone. This was unusual. Students who ate alone were readable as isolated, and isolation was a vulnerability the ranking system could exploit. But Lusk had reached a level of assessed competence, where isolation signaled confidence rather than weakness, and the distinction was understood by anyone paying attention. Kindra ate with 2 other mid-tier students, a comfortable, unremarkable arrangement that suited all 3 of them. She did not look at Lusk. She looked once at the high window on the dining hall's north wall, through which, at this angle, a corner of the tower was visible against the darkening sky. The tower window was lit. It was always lit. Rat did not go to the dining hall. He had a habit, developed quietly without calling attention to it, of spending the dinner hour in one of the Academy's maintenance corridors, a space that appeared on the building's schematics as a utility passage and was used by maintenance workers twice a day and otherwise empty. He brought food from the hall in the morning, ate it cold in the evening, and spent the dinner hour in the specific peace of being genuinely alone in a building where genuine aloneness was otherwise unavailable. He sat with his back against the stone wall and listened to the building around him. The pipes carried sound, conversations from the dining hall, the distant rhythm of the kitchen, occasionally footsteps from above. He had learned the building's acoustic map across 8 months of evenings here, and could identify the location and number of people in most parts of the structure from the sounds the pipes transmitted. Tonight there was something different. Not a sound, exactly. More a quality, a change in the pressure of the air, the way the cold seemed to deepen slightly in the passage. A faint vibration in the stone behind his back that had not been there yesterday. He put his hand flat against the wall. The vibration was real, too faint for ordinary senses, present to his. He could not identify its source. He held his hand against the wall for a long time. Then he took his hand away, finished his food, and went to his bunk. He did not mention it to anyone. At the 19th hour, the Academy's population was distributed across its dormitories and study rooms. The day officially ended, the building quieting by degrees as the institution's metabolism settled into its nocturnal pattern. In the tower above them all, a lamp burned at the workbench. Scabrous stood at the window. Below, the Academy's courtyard was empty. The students inside, the cold outside, the ice fields beyond the perimeter wall running to the horizon in every direction under a sky that had gone fully dark. 2 moons were visible, both small, both dim, casting almost no light. The courtyard's exterior lamps put down circles of pale illumination on the stone that the dark gathered around and pressed against. He had watched this same view from this same window for 15 years. It had not changed. The academy had not changed. The students changed. Cohort after cohort, each one largely indistinguishable from the last in aggregate. Individually distinct in ways that were occasionally interesting and usually not. The instructors changed on longer cycles. The institution remained. He was not watching it out of any feeling about it. He was watching it because the window was between him and the workbench. And he had developed the habit, across 15 years, of standing at the window for a few minutes, at the end of the day before returning to the work, not as rest, as transition. The clearing of the administrative residue of the day's institutional functions before the real focus resumed. Behind him, on the workbench, Dria's holocron sat open beside a fresh data slate. He had 3 new questions for it. He turned from the window. In dormitory 4, in the 3rd bunk, from the left in the 2nd row, Rance Lusk lay on his back and stared at the ceiling. The dormitory was dark, except for the faint glow of exterior lamps through the single high window. Around him, other students slept or pretended to sleep. The building had settled into its night sounds, the pipes, the wind against the stone exterior, the occasional distant movement of someone in a corridor. He was trying to remember what Scabrous had said to him. Not 3 days from now. That appointment was upcoming. The previous session, 6 weeks ago, his first private instruction session in the tower. He had come out of it with the clear memory of entering and the clear memory of leaving, and a gap in between that he could not fill. He remembered the room. He remembered the headmaster's voice, low, measured, the same pace as always. He remembered the sensation of the force moving through him in ways that his regular training had not produced. He did not remember the content. He had told himself, 6 weeks ago, that this was concentration lag, the mental fatigue of intense force application work, producing gaps in declarative memory, a known phenomenon documented in the training texts. He had told himself this was normal. He was finding this explanation less convincing as the days passed and the gap did not fill. Outside, the wind moved across Odessa Forstin's ice fields. The tower lamp burned. The ceiling gave Lusk no answers. He stared at it until the building's night sounds blurred together. And something that was not quite sleep took him under. The words were still gone in the morning. The dead man spoke for the first time on a night in the 3rd month. Not loudly, not dramatically. The holocron simply, between one moment and the next, produced a figure above its surface, small and precise. The projection of a man who had been dead for 5 centuries, rendered in the cold blue light that holocron technology used, regardless of the era that built it. Scabrous set down his stylus. He looked at the figure. The figure looked back. Not at Scabrous specifically, but in the way that recorded projections looked, which was outward, toward whoever was present. The gaze calibrated to seem direct, without being genuinely responsive. Drea had been a thin man, older than Scabrous had expected from the early notes. The handwriting in the physical documents had suggested someone younger. The compressed precision of a hand that had not yet developed the slight irregularity of age. The projection showed the irregularity. Drea had been old when he recorded this first layer. His eyes, in the blue projection light, were the eyes of someone who had spent decades looking at small things carefully. He spoke for 4 minutes. What he said was not the formula. It was not even close to the formula. It was a question. A single precisely worded question about the relationship between force sensitivity and biological receptivity in non-sentient organisms, phrased in the technical language of Sith alchemical theory. The question required an answer. The holocron was waiting for the answer. Scabrous picked up his stylus and began working through the problem. He had found the device 4 months earlier, in the sub-basement archive behind the specimen containers, on a shelf recess, not immediately visible from the room's entrance. He had known what it was the moment he saw it. The size, the surface material, the specific way it absorbed light rather than reflecting it, all consistent with Sith holocron construction from the period his research had identified. He had carried it to the tower with the careful handling of someone who understood that old Force artifacts could be unstable and who intended to be the one who opened it on his terms, not on the artifacts. 11 days of analysis before attempting activation. He had mapped its external structure, tested its material composition, identified the gatekeeper seals, 3 of them layered, each one requiring a different kind of force application to release. The outermost seal responded to dark side attunement at a specific frequency. The middle seal responded to demonstrated knowledge of Sith alchemical theory. The innermost seal, the one guarding the core, he had not been able to assess from outside. On the 12th day, he had released the outermost seal. The figure had appeared on the 3rd month. Between those 2 events, 4 months of silence, the holocrons sitting on his workbench, closed, giving nothing, while Scabrous continued his parallel research threads and waited with the patience that 15 years of long-term work had built into him structurally. He had not been frustrated by the silence. He had used it to prepare. The first gate took 3 months to pass. Dria's opening question, the one about force sensitivity and biological receptivity, was not answerable from a single angle. It required synthesis, alchemical theory, force biology, botanical mechanics, and a working understanding of how the dark side interacted with living organisms at the cellular level. Scabrous spent those 3 months building his answer from all 4 directions simultaneously, cross-referencing Dria's physical notes against his own research, identifying gaps and filling them, constructing a response that was not simply correct but demonstrably correct in the specific framework Dria had been working within. When he spoke the answer aloud to the closed holocron, on a night in the 6th month, alone in the tower, the words precise and unhurried. The device opened the 2nd gate immediately. No pause, no hesitation. The figure appeared again, older now in the projection, and asked a second question. This one was harder. The 2nd gate took 8 months. The question concerned the sickness, not by that name, which Scabrous did not yet know, but by its mechanism. A specific hypothetical pathogen that Dria described in careful technical terms, asking Scabrous to identify the conditions under which such a pathogen could be neutralized by its own host compound, rather than continuing to propagate. It was a more complex problem than the first gate, and it was a test in a different way. The first gate had tested knowledge. This one tested judgment, because answering it correctly required understanding not just the pathogen's chemistry, but why Dria had created it. Or rather, why Dria had created the conditions that produced it as a byproduct, which required understanding what he had been trying to build in the first place. The question could not be answered in isolation. It required the answerer to have already reconstructed the larger project from the physical notes alone, without the holocron's guidance, and to be reasoning about the pathogen in that context. Dria had built the gate to filter out anyone who had found the holocron without doing the prior work. Scabrous had done the prior work. He answered the 2nd gate in the 14th month. The figure appeared a 3rd time, younger again now, or rather, a different recording from an earlier period in Dria's life, the projection less worn, the eyes sharper. And this time, after the answer was accepted, the figure did not ask a question. It spoke for 40 minutes. What came through the 2nd gate was the framework, not the complete formula, not yet, but the architecture of what Dria had been building, laid out in the precise sequential language of a man who had spent decades thinking about how to communicate complex ideas to a stranger he would never meet. The plant was called a Murakami orchid in some botanical catalogues, though Dria did not use that name. He used the old Sith designation, which translated roughly as the bridge specimen, a name that reflected its function rather than its appearance. It was force reactive in a way that no other plant species in Dreer's documented research shared. Not simply sensitive to force presence, but actively responsive to the quality of that presence, growing or contracting, opening or closing, in direct relationship with the attunement of whoever tended it. Dreer had spent 40 years learning what quality of attunement it required. The projection described those 40 years in 40 minutes. Not as biography, but as data. Failed experiments, corrected variables, the slow narrowing of the parameter space until only one configuration produced. The result the plant was capable of producing. Scabrous took 18 pages of notes. He did not interrupt. When the projection finished, the holocron went dark again. Another gate. The third gate was different from the first two. It was not a question. It was an instruction. The holocron, in Dreer's recorded voice, without a projection, told Scabrous to go to the sub-basement archive and retrieve specimen container 7 from the left shelf, second row, to open it under controlled conditions, to analyze the contents and return with the results. Scabrous had already opened specimen container 7. He had done it in his second month, before the holocron had spoken at all, as part of his systematic analysis of everything in the archive. The container had held a biological sample, degraded, centuries old, but partially viable in the specific way of materials that had been preserved in stone chambers at sub-zero temperatures. He had run a full analysis. He had filed the results in his research records. He retrieved those records. He spoke the results to the closed holocron in the precise technical language Dreer's framework required. The third gate opened in under 4 minutes. What came through it made the previous 2 gates seem like preliminary exercises. The formula itself took 6 months to transmit, not because it was imprecise. Dreer's recorded explanation was the clearest, most systematically organized piece of alchemical theory Scabrous had encountered in 15 years of research. It was complex because it was complete. Every variable accounted for. Every interaction between the bloom compound and the alchemical preparation documented with the specificity of someone who had tested each element separately before combining them. Scabrous absorbed it in layers, the way the holocron delivered it. Each session building on the previous one. Each new piece of the formula fitting into the architecture he had spent years constructing from the physical notes alone. There were moments when what the holocron described confirmed what he had already theorized. There were moments when it corrected him. Instances where his reconstruction had been close, but not exact. Where Dreer's actual working differed from Scabrous's projection of it in ways that mattered. He noted every correction without defensiveness. Corrections were information. Information was the point. The sickness arrived in the 4th month of the 3rd gate, named now, defined now, its mechanism laid out with the same precision Dreer applied to everything. The pathogen was a byproduct, not designed, not intended, but not entirely surprising to a man who had spent decades working with compounds at the boundary between life and the processes that unmade it. It existed in the bloom compound in its inert state. Partial bloom activated it. Complete bloom neutralized it. The threshold was the problem Dreer had never fully solved. He knew the threshold existed. He had calculated it approximately. Somewhere between 85 and 95% bloom completion. The pathogen transitioning from active to neutralized. But he had not been able to narrow the range further, because narrowing it required a test subject who reached that range and survived to provide measurable data. And every test subject Dreer had used had activated the pathogen before reaching it. Scabrous listened to this section of the transmission twice. Then he went to his own research files. The parallel work he had been conducting on the specimen containers, the degraded biological materials, the partial analysis data he had accumulated across years of studying what Dreer had left behind. and began applying the formula's complete framework to that data retroactively. The calculation took 11 days. The threshold was 93%. He wrote the number at the top of a clean data slate and underlined it once. The final gate opened in the 29th month. There was no question, no instruction, no test. The figure appeared above the holocron's surface. Old now, the oldest projection in the sequence. Dreer at the end of his life. The recording made in the vault beneath the temple on the frozen world. The quality of the projection was slightly degraded compared to the earlier ones, as though the device recording it had been operating in suboptimal conditions. The chamber behind the figure was stone. The light source was artificial and low. The temperature, readable in the slight visual distortion of the image, was very cold. Dreer looked directly outward. He spoke for 22 minutes. He described everything, not the formula, that had already been transmitted. This was different. This was the account of the failure, the acolyte, the partial bloom, the first appearance of the sickness, the 11 days between infection and this recording. His voice, in the first minutes, was the same measured precision as every previous transmission. By the 10th minute, it had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious to someone not listening carefully. But Scabrous was always listening carefully, and the change was there. A slight flatness in certain consonants, a marginally increased pause between some sentences, the voice of a body beginning to work against the mind directing it. Dreer did not acknowledge this. He kept recording. In the final minutes, he addressed the person receiving the transmission directly. Not by name, because he did not know who would eventually pass through his gates, but with the specific directness of someone who had been waiting 29 months to be heard. He said, "The caretaker is the variable I did not solve. I used a Sith-trained practitioner. This was the error. The plant requires something the dark side's training methodologies specifically removes from a Force sensitive's attunement profile. I do not have the language to name what it requires precisely. I know only what it does not accept. You will have to solve this yourself." He paused, he said. "I trust you have already begun." The projection ended. The holocron closed. Scabrous sat in the silence of the tower for a long time, not in response to the weight of what he had heard, not in the way that a person might sit with the emotional residue of something significant. He sat because sitting was efficient when processing required focus, and what he was processing required considerable focus. Dreer's final transmission had confirmed everything he had theorized about the caretaker problem, and added one piece he had not fully accounted for: the language Dreer had used, something the dark side's training methodology specifically removes. He turned this over carefully. Sith training did not simply add aggression to a Force sensitive's attunement profile. It removed things. It removed the passive receptivity that young Force sensitives carried before formal training began. The quality that children had, that untrained adults sometimes retained, the ability to receive from the Force rather than projecting into it. The dark side's methodology burned that quality away deliberately, because receptivity was vulnerability, and vulnerability was weakness, and weakness was death in the Sith's framework. What Dreer's plant required was exactly that receptivity. Not power, not strength, not combat attunement. The capacity to receive from a living organism, to respond to it rather than directing it, to be in relationship with it rather than in dominance over it. The Jedi had practitioners who developed this quality specifically. Not the warrior Jedi, not the consulars or the guardians or the political operatives who moved through the Republic's institutional structures, the ones assigned to the agricultural corps. The practitioners whose Force sensitivity expressed itself in the gentle, attentive relationship with growing things that the Jedi Order's mainstream considered a lesser calling. They were not a lesser calling. They were precisely what was required. He spent 3 weeks confirming this conclusion from every direction available to him. He reviewed everything the Imperial Intelligence Archives held on Jedi agricultural core operations, postings, assignments, specialist designations, the specific training methodology used for practitioners identified as having botanical force attunement. He cross-referenced against Dreer's plant biology data, mapping the attunement profile described in the holocron transmission against the documented characteristics of agricultural core training. The match was exact, not approximate, not close, exact. He sat with this for one additional day, not from doubt, but from the habit of sitting with confirmed conclusions for 24 hours before acting on them. A discipline he had developed early in his research life, because the cost of acting on a wrong conclusion was always higher than the cost of waiting one more day. The conclusion held. On the morning of the 22nd day after the holocron closed, he opened a star chart. The Jedi Agricultural Corps maintained postings across a wide band of outer rim systems. Remote agricultural worlds, research stations on planets being assessed for settlement, isolated monitoring posts where a single specialist might be assigned for months or years with minimal contact with the broader order. These postings appeared in Republic agricultural records as routine institutional assignments. They did not appear in Jedi combat deployment records, which was the database Imperial Intelligence prioritized. But they were findable, cross-referencing agricultural stations staffing records against Jedi Order personnel files, both accessible through different channels. Neither one classified at a level that required special authorization to access. Produced a list of current agricultural core postings in the Outer Rim. 43 stations, 43 practitioners. Of those, 11 were designated as Murakami Orchid Specialists. Of those 11, 4 were posted alone. Single practitioner stations, no Padawans, no supporting personnel. Worlds remote enough that an incident would not trigger an immediate Jedi response. He marked those 4. He began building operational profiles on each one: location, access routes, station layout, the practitioner's documented background, their years of service, their last recorded contact with the main temple. The work was careful and unhurried. There was no urgency. The vessel was still in the Dromonkas archive, where it had been for over a century. The transfer authorization was moving through the institutional channels. At the pace of institutional channels, everywhere. The formula was complete. The threshold was calculated. The preparation timeline was mapped. Everything was converging. It was simply a matter of identifying which of the 4 practitioners was most precisely suited to what the plant required, and most precisely situated for a clean, unrecorded acquisition. He would not rush this. Rushing was how Dreer had failed. Outside the tower window, Odassa Forstin's 2 moons had risen, both dim, both small, the light they cast barely reaching the courtyard below. The Academy's night sounds moved through the stone walls in their familiar pattern. Somewhere in the dormitories, students slept or did not sleep. The instructors were in their quarters. The maintenance workers had finished their rounds. The star chart on Scabrous' workbench showed 4 points of light in the outer rim. 4 stations, 4 practitioners. One of them was exactly what he needed. He studied the 4 profiles for a long time, cross-referencing each one against Dreer's attunement parameters, applying the metrics he had built from the transmission's data. By the 3rd hour of the night, he had narrowed the list to 2. By the 5th hour, to 1. He set down his stylus. He looked at the name at the top of the profile. Then he began drafting the operational plan, methodical, layered, every contingency addressed, every variable mapped against the 93% threshold that separated the outcome he intended from the outcome that had killed Darth Dreer in a sealed vault on a frozen world 5 centuries ago. He had not come this far to repeat someone else's error. The draft took the rest of the night. When the pale grey of Odosair Forsten's dawn began at the window, the plan was complete. He set it aside. He closed the star chart. He went to the small basin near the window, washed his face in the cold water, and stood looking out at the empty courtyard below as the Academy's population began its morning routines. Somewhere in the outer rim, a young woman was tending plants. She did not know his name. She would. The crate arrived on a transport that did not officially land on Odosair Forsten. This was not unusual. Scabrous had spent 3 years building the logistics chain specifically to produce this result. A delivery pathway that moved through 4 separate intermediary transfers, each one documented under a different institutional reference, none of them traceable back to the Frozen Academy at the end of the route, without the kind of sustained investigative effort that no one had reason to apply to a routine archive transfer. The transport set down on the ice field, 2 kilometers from the Academy's perimeter, in the pre-dawn dark, and a single cargo container was offloaded onto a crawler that Scabrous had positioned there the previous evening. The transport lifted before full light. The crawler moved across the ice toward the Academy's service entrance at the pace. Crawlers moved across uneven, frozen ground. Slowly, without urgency, the cargo secured in the insulated bay. Scabrous was at the service entrance when it arrived, not because he needed to be. The Academy's maintenance staff could have received a cargo delivery without his presence and asked no questions about it. They had learned across 15 years that certain deliveries were not their concern. He was there because after 15 years of working toward this specific moment, he found that he preferred to receive it himself. He did not examine this preference closely. He uncoupled the insulated bay, lifted the cargo container. It was heavy, the Durasteel housing adding considerable mass to the stasis equipment inside, and carried it through the service corridor to the lift that accessed the tower. He did not ask for help. The tower's upper room looked different with the crate on the workbench, not visually different. The crate was a standard archive transit container, grey Durasteel with institutional markings. Nothing that would read as significant to anyone who did not know what was inside it. But the quality of the room's atmosphere had shifted in a way that Scabrous registered, without being able to attribute it precisely to anything measurable. The tower had held Dria's holocron for 10 years. It had held 15 years of accumulated research materials. It had held the physical documents from the sub-basement archive, the specimen containers, the data slates stacked in the precise ordering system that Scabrous had developed and maintained without variation. All of that was present and accounted for. What was new was the crate. He stood looking at it for a moment. Then he retrieved his cutting tool from the instrument drawer and began opening the seals. The archive had processed the transfer without difficulty. This was the expected outcome. Scabrous had spent 3 years building the documentation trail precisely so that the processing would be routine. But expected outcomes still required confirmation, and the confirmation had arrived 6 weeks ago, in the form of a standard transfer acknowledgement from the Dromund Car's administration office. Reference number matching, item condition logged as satisfactory, transit authorization stamped and filed. The political groundwork had been the more delicate element. The Imperial Archive system did not simply release catalogued items on request, regardless of how well documented the request was. It required institutional authorization at a level above the requesting party's own classification. A stamp from an office with sufficient standing to authorize a transfer from a protected collection. Scabrous had no direct standing with the relevant office. He had, however, spent 18 months cultivating a relationship with a mid-level intelligence administrator on Dromund Cars who had standing, and who owed Scabrous a debt of the particular kind that mid-level administrators in Imperial systems accrued when they made certain decisions in the first year of a new posting. and needed those decisions to remain unexamined. The administrator had provided the stamp. He had not asked what was being transferred. Scabrous had not told him. The debt was now cleared. The administrator was no longer useful. These facts were noted in Scabrous's records, with the same neutral precision as everything else. The outer seals of the transit crate came away cleanly. Inside, protective packing material, dense and carefully packed around a secondary container. A smaller box of the same grey durasteel, sealed with archive preservation locks that required a specific tool to release. Scabrous had the tool. He had obtained it 2 years ago, before the transfer was even initiated. Because preparation meant having what you needed before you needed it. The secondary container opened. Inside that, the housing itself. He lifted it out with both hands. It was heavier than its size suggested. The durasteel body was thick, built to last. Built by someone who understood that what it contained needed to survive circumstances the builder could not predict. The surface was dark, almost black in certain lights, with a slight texture that was not quite metal and not quite stone. The result? Scabrous understood from Dreer's notes, of an alchemical treatment applied to the exterior during construction, a hardening process that made the material resistant to most forms of physical and force-based damage. He set it on the cleared workbench surface and looked at it properly for the first time. The transparent steel panel on the front face was dark. The stasis field inside ran deep, and whatever was within was not visible at this angle, in this light. He moved the lamp closer. The panel remained opaque. The stasis was functioning as designed, which meant the interior was operating at a temperature and force density that light did not penetrate in a useful way from outside. He would not open it here, but he could examine the exterior. He turned it slowly, methodically, the way he examined everything, starting at the base and working upward, noting each surface in sequence. The base ring. He had known about the inscription from Dreer's physical notes, which described it in summary. The ritual instructions, etched in Old Sith by Dreer's own hand, running the full circumference of the base. What the notes had not conveyed was the quality of the lettering itself. Small, even, unhurried. The script of someone who had taken considerable time with each character. The inscription was complete. No gaps, no degradation visible to the eye. The old Sith characters as legible as the day they were cut. Scabrous read the full inscription without difficulty. He had spent 3 years specifically developing his fluency in this dialect of Old Sith, because Dreer's holocron had used it throughout, and because the inscription, which he had known he would eventually encounter, required it. The ritual instructions were precise, more precise, in some particulars, than the holocron transmission had been. Because the inscription had been written after the transmission was recorded and incorporated refinements from Dreer's final months of work, he read it twice. He noted 3 points where the inscription added detail not present in the transmission. He committed those points to memory before moving on. The upper seal carried the crack. He had known about this too. The archive transfer records included a condition assessment, and the condition assessment had noted minor pre-existing damage to upper seal, hairline fracture, non-structural, preservation integrity, unaffected. The assessment was accurate. The crack ran across the full width of the seal's upper face, thin enough that it required good light to see clearly, old enough that the edges had the slightly softened look of damage that had been stable for a very long time. He ran his finger along it. The crack was cold under his fingertip. Everything on this world was cold, but the metal of the housing held temperature differently than the stone of the building. A denser, more stable cold that came from the material itself, rather than from the air around it. The seal was intact. The crack was cosmetic. He moved on. The back face was unremarkable, or rather, it would have been unremarkable under ordinary examination. because the back face of a sealed archive container was the face no one looked at. The surface turned toward the wall in storage. The side without the viewing panel, or the inscription, or any feature that drew attention. Scabrous looked at it anyway. The back face was clean. He set the housing down on the workbench, with the transparent steel panel facing him, and the inscription ring visible at the base, and placed both hands flat on the upper surface. He closed his eyes. He applied the force outward, not aggressively, not with the projecting intensity that combat applications required, but with the careful, controlled extension of a researcher conducting a resonance assessment, feeling for the object's force signature, the way you felt for a specific frequency in a complex signal. What he found was not a frequency, it was a wall. The force resonance of the housing hit him with a density he had not prepared for, not hostile, not in the way that dark side artifacts sometimes produced hostility, pushing back against a reader's attunement with something that resembled intent. This was different. This was accumulated weight. Decades of a stasis field operating at deep levels, the alchemical treatment on the exterior surface, and beneath both of those, something older and more fundamental that he could not immediately categorize. He pressed in harder. The wall did not give, but through it, at the edges, he began to feel the interior, not clearly, not with the precision that a direct reading would have produced, but in outline, the stasis field, the contained space, and within the contained space, something alive, faintly, distantly, through layers of preservation technology and alchemical shielding, but unmistakably present. The plant. He had known it was there. He had known it was alive. The stasis was designed to maintain it indefinitely, and there was no reason to believe it had failed in the centuries since Drea sealed it. But knowing and sensing were different things, and the sensation of that faint living presence through the wall of the housing's resonance field was different from anything his intellectual understanding of it had produced. He pressed deeper. The wall collapsed. It lasted less than 2 seconds. The force lightning came from both hands simultaneously. Not directed, not intentional. The involuntary discharge of a resonance assessment that had gone past the threshold his control could maintain. It cracked across the workbench surface, jumped to the housing's back face, and left 3 distinct marks on the metal before Scabrous pulled back, with the sharp, complete withdrawal of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of loss of control and had never expected to actually experience it. He stepped back from the workbench. The room was very quiet. His hands were steady. He checked this, because the check was the first step in the recovery protocol he had developed for situations involving uncontrolled force discharge. And following the protocol was automatic at this point. Hands steady, breathing controlled, no secondary discharge. He looked at the housing. The 3 marks on the back face were small, centimeter scale, each one a slightly darkened patch where the lightning had contacted the alchemical surface, and the surface had absorbed it without structural damage. The housing was intact. The seal was intact. The stasis field, readable now from the slight hum he could feel through the floor, was functioning without interruption. He looked at the marks for a moment. Then he turned the housing, so the marked face was against the wall. He did not note the marks in his records. He stood looking at the housing, front face toward him now, transparent steel panel dark, inscription ring at the base, for a long time, not processing, not planning, just standing with it, in the way he had stood at the tower window, at the end of difficult days, the transition state between one mode of engagement and another. The housing had been sealed for 5 centuries. It had passed through hands he could partially account for, and hands he could not. It had sat in an archive drawer for generations, maintained by people who did not know what it was. It had traveled routes that were not in any record he had been able to reconstruct completely. And now it was here, on this world, in this building, 3 floors above the underground temple that Drea had constructed to house it. The specific space it had been built to occupy, the stone plinth that Drea had cut from the planet's own rock to hold it, that was where it belonged. Scabrous lifted it from the workbench. The passage to the underground temple was not on any official schematic of the Academy's structure. Scabrous had found the entrance in his 2nd year, a section of the sub-basement archives floor that resonated differently under a force probe, the stone thinner there, a hollow space below. He had cleared the access point methodically, over several weeks, during the hours when the archive was empty. The passage descended at a consistent angle for approximately 40 meters, before opening into the temple chamber proper. He had excavated the chamber carefully, not quickly. The stone was old, the construction technique ancient, and he had needed to understand the structural principles before removing any material. He had spent 3 months studying before he touched anything. The excavation itself had taken 8 months. He had done all of it alone. What he had uncovered was exactly what Drea's holocron had described. A chamber of moderate size, stone walls sealed with an alchemical compound that had preserved them across 5 centuries in near-perfect condition. A stone plinth at the center cut from the native rock, and on the plinth, a depression of exactly the right dimensions to hold what Scabrous was now carrying. The plinth was empty. It had been empty since Drea placed the housing there, and then at some point in the 5 centuries between then and now, it had been removed. The housing was coming back. The temperature dropped as he descended, not because the passage was colder than the tower. Both were cold. The planet's cold working through stone at the same rate regardless of depth. The drop was something else. A quality that was not temperature exactly but registered as temperature's neighbor. A deepening of something that the body interpreted as cold because it had no better category for it. The force resonance of the space changed with the depth. The alchemical sealing compound on the walls had accumulated something across 5 centuries. Not a presence, not an awareness, but a density. The way a room accumulates the residue of everything that has happened in it, without becoming sentient about any of it. The chamber at the bottom of the passage held that density at its maximum. Scabrous felt it the moment he stepped through the entrance. He had felt it every time he came down here. Today it was different, heavier, more immediate. And he understood after a moment that the difference was the housing in his hands, the object returning to the space it had been built for, the resonance of the container meeting the resonance of the room. 2 elements of the same original design coming back into proximity after a very long separation, not dramatic, not loud, a settling, the specific quality of something finding its correct position after a long displacement. He crossed the chamber to the plinth. He lowered the housing into the depression. It fit exactly. The base ring's edges met the plinth's carved edges, with the precision of something made for this specific surface, by the same hands that made the surface. The inscription, running the circumference of the base ring, faced outward in all directions. Scabrous straightened. He stood in front of the plinth and looked at the housing in the chamber's cold and dense silence. The transparent steel panel was dark. The stasis held. The 3 burn marks were against the wall, as he had arranged them. He did not move for a long time. When he came back up to the tower, the pre-dawn grey was beginning at the window. He sat at the desk. He opened 3 separate data slates, each one configured for a different outgoing channel, each channel routed through a different intermediary node, each node untraceable back to Odessa Forstin, without a level of investigative effort that the Republic did not apply to quiet Outer Rim worlds, and the Sith Empire did not apply to its own institutions. He composed 3 messages. Each one was addressed to a different party: a bounty broker on Nar Shaddaa, a freelance acquisitions operative in the Mid-Rim, and a hunter whose reputation he had been tracking for 2 years. and who came recommended through a chain of intermediaries whose judgment he had reason to trust. Each message contained the same operational profile. Target: Force-sensitive individual, Jedi Agricultural Corps designation, botanical specialty confirmed, outer rim posting, currently assigned solo, condition of delivery, alive, unharmed, no physical damage, no force suppression compounds, no psychological intervention of any kind prior to delivery. The word unharmed appeared in each message. In each message, it was underlined. The plant would know. He sent all three. He closed the data slates. Outside the window, Odysseus Faustin's pale dawn settled across the ice fields the way it always did. Without ceremony, without warmth, the light arriving because it always arrived, and meaning nothing beyond that. Below the tower, below the academy, below the sub-basement archive, the housing sat on its plinth in the dark. The inscription faced outward, the stasis held. Something was coming back to this world. It had not arrived yet, but it was closer than it had ever been. The first acolyte who showed symptoms did not report them. This was expected. Reporting weakness at Odysseus Faustin was its own kind of death. Slower than the alternatives, but just as certain. The boy had noticed the discoloration on his left forearm 3 days after it appeared, had covered it with his sleeve, and had continued attending training sessions with the focused determination of someone who understood that visibility was survival. He lasted 11 days before the progression became impossible to hide. Scabrous had been monitoring him throughout, not with concern. With instruments, the same careful measurement he applied to everything in the tower's ongoing research threads, the data accumulating in clean columns on his data slate. Each day's readings filed against the previous days. The rate of progression charted against the theoretical model he had built from Dria's notes and his own calculations. The model was accurate within 4%. He noted this at the top of the file and underlined it. Then he had the boy removed from the general population and placed in the tower's lower isolation room, where the progression could be observed through its remaining stages, without the complication of transmission to the dormitory population. The boy did not understand what was happening to him. Scabrous did not explain it. Explanation was not part of the protocol. The water supply introduction had begun 14 months after the housing arrived on the frozen world. Not immediately. Scabrous had spent that 14 months completing the preparation compound synthesis, a process that required precision at every stage and could not be rushed without producing an unstable result. The compound itself was not the sickness. It was the alchemical preparation that Dria's formula required the ritual subject to carry in their bloodstream before the bloom occurred. A biological priming agent that would make the body receptive to the bloom compound when it was released. Dria had administered this preparation directly to a single subject in controlled doses over a defined period. Scabrous had modified the delivery method. Not the compound was Dria's, synthesized to exact specification. The modification was in scale and distribution. The ritual required one primary subject, the caretaker, whose prepared body would receive the bloom compound and undergo the transformation. But the formula's secondary applications, which Dria had documented but not fully explored, suggested that the preparation compound, distributed at low concentrations across a larger population, would create a baseline biological environment in the surrounding bodies that enhanced the ritual's central effect. In other words, the entire academy, prepared over years without their knowledge, would amplify what happened to the one person at the center. The water supply was the delivery mechanism. The dosage was calibrated to produce no observable symptoms in healthy subjects at normal exposure levels. Scabrous had spent 6 months on that calibration specifically, running the numbers, testing the threshold concentrations, confirming that the compound was undetectable by any diagnostic tool the Academy's medical station carried. He had confirmed all of this before introducing a single drop. The acolyte with the forearm discoloration was not a dosage failure. He was a data point, a subject whose individual biochemistry sat at the outer edge of the distribution Scabrous had modeled, where the compound's effects expressed differently than in the central population. A known risk, quantified in the preparation documentation, acceptable within the parameters of a project this scale. The boy's 11 days of data had narrowed the outer edge profile considerably. His file was closed and archived when the progression completed. The temple preparation was the work Scabrous valued most, not because it was the most intellectually demanding element of the project. The formula synthesis and the caretaker identification had both required more abstract reasoning, but the temple work was physical, precise, and entirely his own. No precedent in Dria's records, no guidance from the holocron transmission, just Scabrous applying his understanding of the ritual's requirements to a specific stone chamber 40 meters underground, and making that chamber into the exact environment the ritual needed. He worked on it in the hours between the Academy's last scheduled activity and the pre-dawn period, when the building was fully quiet and the passage down to the sub-basement archive produced no risk of encounter. 4 hours most nights. Occasionally 6, when a specific element required sustained concentration. The ritual space itself was the primary construction, a marked area on the chamber floor, defined by alchemical compounds applied in a pattern derived from the base ring inscription's instructions. The lines precise and measured, the materials sourced through the same indirect acquisition channels he used for everything sensitive. The marking compounds were not simply decorative, they were functional. They would concentrate and direct the force resonance generated during the bloom, focusing the compounds released toward the ritual subject's prepared body, rather than dispersing it across the chamber. He had tested the marking pattern's resonance properties 3 times before accepting it as complete. Adjacent to the ritual space, the preparation station, the equipment required to administer the final concentrated dose of the preparation compound to the caretaker in the hours before the bloom trigger. Adjacent to that, the containment provisions, because the 93% threshold was calculated, not guaranteed, and calculated thresholds had tolerances, and tolerances meant scenarios that required management. The containment provisions were thorough. Scabrous was always thorough about the things that could go wrong. The private instruction sessions with Lusk had begun in the 3rd year of the preparation period. Lusk was not the only acolyte Scabrous had identified as potentially useful. He had profiled the entire current cohort in the 1st year, rating each one against a set of criteria that had nothing to do with the Academy's standard assessment metrics: combat rank, force application scores, institutional standing. None of these were what he was measuring. He was measuring cognitive flexibility under force influence, the capacity to hold contradictory instructions simultaneously, the depth of susceptibility to specific dark side mental techniques that operated below the subject's conscious awareness. Not crude domination, which left marks and produced resistance, but the subtle layered approach that required a practitioner of considerable skill to execute, and a subject of specific neurological profile to receive. Lusk had ranked first on every criterion. The sessions were conducted in the tower's lower room, not the isolation room, a different space, configured for the specific work. Scabrous would bring Lusk in, conduct the session, and send him out. The sessions lasted between 40 minutes and 2 hours. Lusk experienced them as intense force training, demanding, disorienting, occasionally painful in the way that pushing against a force technique's limits was painful. He experienced them as genuine instruction. He was being instructed, just not in what he believed. What Scabrous was building in Lusk across those sessions was a layered command structure, a set of behavioral protocols embedded below conscious access, designed to activate under specific trigger conditions. The protocols would not make Lusk a puppet. They would make him a contingency, a resource available if the ritual produced complications that required a second set of hands operating without hesitation or independent judgment in a high-stress environment. Whether those contingencies would be needed depended on variables Scabrous could not fully predict. He preferred to have the resource and not require it than to require it and not have prepared it. Lusk, for his part, had resolved his unease about the missing memories. Not by recovering them, those gaps remained, static and permanent. The words from the session simply absent from his accessible recall. In a way he had stopped trying to examine. He had resolved his unease by recategorizing it. The headmaster's methods were not standard. That was known. The private sessions involved techniques beyond the academy's curriculum. That was their value. The disorientation he experienced afterward, the fatigue, the hours of fragmented sleep, these were the cost of instruction that other students did not receive and would not be offered. He was ranked second now. He had been fourth when the sessions began. The correlation was clear enough that examining the discomfort seemed unnecessary. He ate in the dining hall with the confidence of someone who understood their position in the hierarchy, had shifted and intended to consolidate that shift. He trained with more precision than he had shown in his first 3 years. He slept poorly 3 nights out of 7 and did not mention this to anyone. The words were still gone. In the 4th year, Scabrous began the transmission tests. These were separate from the water supply monitoring. A different thread, focused not on the preparation compound's distribution, but on the sickness's behavior under controlled conditions, specifically transmission vectors, progression rates under varying conditions of proximity and exposure duration, and the threshold concentrations at which the pathogen crossed from dormant to active in a prepared subject versus an unprepared one. The distinction between prepared and unprepared subjects was critical to the ritual's safety parameters. A body carrying the preparation compound responded to the pathogen differently than an unmodified body. Dree had documented this in general terms. The preparation compound provided some degree of resistance to the sickness's early stages, giving the ritual subject a window of viability during which the bloom could be triggered and the neutralizing effect achieved before the pathogen's progression became irreversible. How wide that window was, exactly, Scabrous had not been able to calculate from Dreer's data alone. He needed to measure it directly. The transmission tests were conducted on unprepared subjects first. Students at the lower end of the cohort, unremarkable enough that their removal from the general population produced no significant social disruption. The data from those tests established the baseline progression timeline. Subsequent tests on subjects who had been in the water supply for varying durations established the preparation compound's protective effect at each exposure level. The window, when calculated from the combined dataset, was wider than Dree notes had suggested. 41 hours in a fully prepared subject at standard water supply exposure duration. Scabrous noted this and felt something that he would have described, if asked, as professional satisfaction. The specific quality of a calculated number proving to be better than the conservative estimate you had built your plan around. 41 hours was sufficient margin. The plan did not need to be revised. The bounty hunter arrived in the 5th year, not the first contracted hunter. That one had sent a brief message 8 months into the search, confirming that the identified target was no longer at the original posting, and requesting additional location data, which Scabrous had provided. No further communication had followed. He had assumed, after 6 months of silence, that the first hunter had encountered a complication and would not be completing the contract. He had not replaced the contract immediately. He had waited 3 months, assessing whether the silence represented a hunter who had failed or a hunter who had found the target and was in the process of acquisition. When the silence extended past the point where either scenario would have produced a communication, he had filed the first contract as inactive and sent 2 replacements. The hunter who arrived in the 5th year was one of the replacements. He landed on the ice field without prior notification, a breach of the operational protocol Scabrous had specified, which required all communications to pass through the intermediary channels before any physical approach to the academy. The breach was itself informative. It suggested either incompetence or urgency, and the kind of urgency that caused an experienced operative to skip established protocol was typically the urgency of someone who had acquired the wrong asset and wanted to convert a mistake into a completed contract before the client examined the details. Scabrous met him at the service entrance. The hunter was a human male, experienced looking, carrying himself with the practiced confidence of someone who had done this kind of work for a long time. He had a containment case with him. The case was the right size for a person. It was sealed. Scabrous looked at the case. He asked one question. The hunter's answer confirmed the suspicion. What was in the case was not a Jedi Agricultural Corps botanical specialist with Murakami orchid expertise and the specific attunement profile that years of cooperative force work with living specimens produced. What was in the case was a Jedi, a different one, a knight, by the description, combat trained, the wrong kind of force sensitivity, the wrong background, the wrong everything. The hunter had located a Jedi in the general region of the posted target and had made a judgment that the client wanted a Jedi and that one Jedi was sufficiently similar to another to fulfill the contract. This judgment was incorrect. The hunter had 4 seconds between understanding that the answer was wrong and the end of his ability to understand anything, not from anger. Scabrous did not experience the situation as provoking. The hunter had failed to meet the contract specifications. The consequences of that failure were defined by the operational context. An individual who had physically located this academy, who knew a contract had been issued from this location, who could not be allowed to carry that information anywhere. The specific technique Scabrous used left no visible marks. He had practiced it across a number of the tower's research sessions over the years. He pressed a panel near the service entrance. The maintenance staff appeared in 4 minutes, as they always did, and removed what needed to be removed. Scabrous went back to the tower. He opened a data slate. He wrote 2 new contracts, more specific than the previous ones. The target profile expanded with additional identifying details. The operational protocol stricter, the consequences of protocol deviation made explicit in language that experienced hunters understood clearly. He sent both through separate channels. He closed the data slate. He picked up the file he had been working on before the interruption and continued where he had left off. The confirmation from the Wifid came 6 weeks later. A single message through the correct intermediary channel, correctly formatted. The authentication code matching. 4 lines. Target identified at current posting. Acquisition in progress. No complications. Estimated delivery. 30 standard days. Scabrous read it once. He set the data slate down. He sat at the desk for a moment. Then he stood, moved to the passage behind the archive shelving, descended the 40 meters to the chamber below, and walked to the plinth at the center. The housing sat where he had placed it 5 years ago. The inscription faced outward. The transparent steel panel was dark. The burn marks on the back face were against the wall, as they had been since the day he turned them there. He stood in front of it in the chamber's cold, dense quiet. Something had shifted, not in the room, not in the housing, in the distance between where the project was and where it needed to go. That distance had contracted to a number he could hold in his hands. 30 days. He had been working toward this for 20 years. 30 days was a number he could hold in his hands. He stood there until the quality of his focus had settled into something he recognized as readiness. Then he went back up to the tower. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. The dying orchid in Greenhouse 7 had been failing for 11 days before Hestizo understood what it needed. Not water, not adjusted light cycles, not the mineral supplement she had introduced on day 3, or the temperature correction on day 6, or the careful repositioning she had attempted on day 9, when nothing else had produced a response. What it needed was for her to stop trying. She understood this on the morning of the 12th day, kneeling on the greenhouse floor with her hands flat in the soil beside the root bed, not doing anything, not adjusting, not supplementing, not applying any of the intervention techniques her training had given her, just present, just still, just extending her awareness into the living system around the roots in the specific passive way that she had spent 7 years developing and that she still could not explain adequately to anyone who had not grown up feeling it themselves. The orchid's root system under her palms was not dying. It was waiting. It had been waiting through 11 days of her interventions, tolerating them, not responding to them, holding itself in a suspended state that her instruments had misread as decline. It was not declining. It was in a kind of dormancy that the standard agricultural core diagnostic protocols did not have a category for, because the protocols had been written by people who understood force-reactive plant species in aggregate and had not spent time with this particular subspecies, which was not aggregate. She stayed still for 40 minutes. The root system under her palms began to move, not visibly, not in a way that any instrument in the greenhouse would have recorded, but she felt it. A slow, deep unfurling, the plant's internal processes resuming at the level where they had paused. The specific quality of living force that the Murakami subspecies generated when it was functioning correctly, returning like warmth, returning to a cold room. She stayed until it was complete. Then she stood, brushed the soil from her hands, and made a note in her station log. Dormancy episode, duration 11 days, resolved through passive attunement. No chemical or environmental intervention required. She did not note how long the resolution had taken, or that she had spent most of it simply kneeling on a dirt floor, doing nothing visible. The log was read by agricultural administrators who valued measurable interventions. Some things did not translate into the language of measurable interventions. The station was called Ragmar Fief in the Republic's Agricultural Survey catalogue, a designation that reflected the survey's priorities rather than anything about the place itself. It was a temperate world, geologically stable, with a growing season that ran 8 standard months and soil composition that supported a range of force-reactive botanical cultivation without significant amendment. The Jedi Agricultural Corps had established the research station 6 years ago to study the adaptation patterns of transplanted force-reactive species in non-native growing conditions. Hestizo had been posted there for 3 years. The station was small, a central research building, 4 greenhouse structures of varying sizes, a small landing pad, accommodation for up to 4 personnel. Currently, it housed 1. The core posting had originally included a second researcher, but that position had been vacant for 14 months following a reassignment, and the administration had not filled it, because the station's research output was satisfactory with 1 practitioner, and the Corps had more pressing staffing priorities in systems closer to the Republic's center. Hestizo had not requested a replacement. She worked better alone. This was not a preference she had chosen so much as a temperament she had identified. She had known from her earliest training years that the quality of her force attunement changed in the presence of other people, pulled towards social awareness in ways that made the deep quiet, listening, that her work required harder to sustain. Alone, she could maintain it continuously. With others, she had to choose between it and the ordinary attention that relationships required. She had chosen the work. Her brother Rojo understood this imperfectly and worried about it consistently. Rojo Trace visited the station 4 times a year. He was 3 years older than Hestizo, trained as a Jedi Guardian, posted to a patrol assignment in a neighboring sector that brought him through this region on a rotation schedule that he had arranged. When he first received the posting, specifically because it put him within reasonable transit distance of his sister's station, he did not tell her he had arranged it this way. She knew, because she knew Rojo, and because the rotation schedule's convenience was not coincidental in the way that things were not coincidental when someone with force sensitivity and strong protective instincts arranged them. She did not tell him she knew. It would have complicated his enjoyment of believing he was being casual about it. His most recent visit had been 6 weeks ago. 3 days, during which he had eaten her food, expressed measured concern about her isolation, argued with her good-naturedly about whether the agricultural corps posting was the right use of her abilities, and left with the particular expression of someone who was reassured, but not entirely reassured, which was his standard expression when he left her. She had watched his ship lift from the landing pad and felt the specific quality of his absence settle into the station. Not loneliness, exactly. More like the return of the station to its correct operating temperature. After the brief warmth of a visitor, she preferred the correct operating temperature. The day Tulk came was not different from other days in any way she registered at the time. She began in Greenhouse 3, running the morning assessment on the long-term adaptation study. 47 specimens of varying force-reactive species, each one monitored across a set of growth and attunement metrics that she recorded daily and transmitted to the Corps administration weekly. The assessment took 2 hours. The data was unremarkable, which was what 2 years into a long-term study looked like. The dramatic findings, if any existed, would emerge across a decade of accumulated data, not in any individual week's numbers. She moved to Greenhouse 7 after that, to check the orchid she had resolved the previous morning. It was doing well, not dramatically well, not visibly altered in any way that would have been noticeable to someone without her attunement to its specific living signature. But the quality of its force presence in the growing bed had stabilized at the level she had felt when the dormancy resolved, steady and clear, the plant fully present in a way it had not been for several weeks. She spent 20 minutes with it, not examining, just present, the passive attunement open, receiving what the plant was generating without directing it anywhere. This was the part of her work that she had never been able to explain in a log entry or a report. The agricultural corps protocols described it as attunement maintenance and assigned it a standard time allocation of 15 minutes per force-reactive specimen per week. She spent considerably more time than the protocol allocated, because 15 minutes per week was the time required to prevent decline in a healthy specimen, and it was not the same as the time required to actually know what a specimen was doing. Knowing what a specimen was doing was the point. She stayed until the orchid felt finished with her presence, a specific quality she had learned to recognize, the plant's signature shifting from receptive to neutral, the way a conversation ends when both parties have said what they had to say. She stood. She brushed her hands clean. She left the greenhouse. Midday was administrative work, log entries, weekly transmission preparation, a maintenance check on the station's water filtration system that had been scheduled for 3 weeks and kept being deprioritized in favor of the living work. She ate while writing the transmission. The meal was simple. The station's food stores were adequate rather than inspired, and she had never developed much interest in the preparation of food beyond what sustained the work. Rojo brought her things when he visited. She ate them while he was there and forgot to miss them when he left. The transmission went out at the 14th hour. She spent the 15th hour in the station's small reference library, reviewing a paper on Murakami subspecies adaptation that had been published by a core researcher on a different station. The paper was careful and thorough and slightly wrong in its conclusions about attunement response in second-generation transplants, because the researcher had measured the wrong variable at the critical stage. She noted this in her own records for a response paper she had been planning for 2 years and had not yet begun writing. At the 16th hour, she went back to the greenhouses. This was the part of the day she valued most. The late afternoon light through the greenhouse panels, the particular quality of the growing specimens in that light, the station completely quiet around her, and the living work completely present. She moved through greenhouse 1, then 2, then 4, making the evening checks. Not assessments, just contact. The attunement open, confirming that each specimen was where it should be in its cycle. In greenhouse 6, she paused longer than the others. There was a Murakami specimen there. Different subspecies from the one in 7, older, further along in its adaptation study, that had been generating a quality she could not categorize. Not distress, not dormancy, something she had no existing term for. A faint resonance that she had been aware of for approximately 3 weeks, without being able to locate its source or meaning. She knelt beside it. She put her hands in the soil. The resonance was there, faint and steady, coming from the direction. She oriented herself carefully, north-northwest by the station's internal compass, which placed it off-world, which made no practical sense, and which she had noted in her personal log, without including in the official transmission, because it was not the kind of observation that translated into administrative language. She stayed with it for 20 minutes. The resonance did not clarify. She stood. She left the greenhouse. She walked back to the main building in the late afternoon light. She did not know what she had been feeling. She would understand later, when it was too late for the understanding to be useful, that she had been feeling the housing in the underground temple 40 meters below the surface of a frozen world, responding to her attunement across the distance between them the way the subspecies in Greenhouse 7 had responded, reaching toward the quality of force presence it had been designed to find. She did not know this then. She went inside and began preparing the evening meal. Talk came at the 19th hour. She heard the landing, a ship setting down on the pad outside. Not a scheduled delivery, no prior communication logged. This happened occasionally. Core supply runs that the administration scheduled without notifying field stations. Traders passing through who identified the station's landing beacon and stopped for fuel assessment. She noted the landing and continued what she was doing, expecting a knock at the main entrance within a few minutes. The knock did not come. What came instead was the greenhouse panel. Greenhouse 2. The sensor she had positioned to alert her to temperature drops after a calibration issue 3 months ago, registering an open door. She had not opened Greenhouse 2. She stood in the station's main corridor and felt the wrongness of that before she fully processed it. Not through the force, just through the ordinary awareness of a person who lived alone and understood the station's patterns and knew that an open door in a building she had not entered since midday was not self-explanatory. She moved toward the greenhouse. She got 6 steps down the corridor. Tulk was large, professional, and positioned between her and every exit she might have reached in the next 4 seconds. He had done this before. The specific body positioning of someone who had acquired unwilling subjects in confined spaces and had calibrated the geometry of the approach to eliminate options before options could be taken. She had no combat training. She had no weapons. She had a deep attunement to living force signatures that told her. In the fraction of a second before the binders closed around her wrists, that this individual was going to complete what he had started, and that the greenhouse behind him was not the relevant fact. Where he was taking her was the relevant fact. She could not determine where. The binders were not standard restraints. They were specifically designed for force sensitives. A suppression compound worked into the material. Not enough to fully dampen her attunement, but enough to reduce it to a distant murmur, the way a thick wall reduced sound. She could still feel the station around her. The greenhouses, the specimens, Greenhouse 7's orchid generating its steady clear signature. But she felt it from behind a barrier that had not been there an hour ago. Tulk said nothing to her beyond the minimum necessary to move her from the corridor to the ship. He was not cruel, he was not kind. He was a professional doing a job, and his interaction with her was the interaction of a professional with the job's object. Efficient, impersonal, without malice or interest. She was in the cargo hold before the full sequence of what had happened had finished assembling itself in her mind. The ship lifted. In hyperspace, the cargo hold was cold and dim and very quiet. She sat with her back against the hold's wall and worked through what she knew, which was not much. The suppression compound in the binders made the force information she could access imprecise. The man who had taken her had not told her anything. The ship's destination was not visible from the hold. She was not panicking. This was not calm. It was the specific functioning of a mind that had developed through years of work that required sustained attention in difficult conditions. The capacity to stay present with what was actually known rather than spiraling into what was feared. She applied it now the way she applied it to a failing specimen. Stay present. Receive what is actually here. Do not impose a narrative that isn't supported by the available information. What was available, she was alive. The binders were restraining, not harmful. Whoever had sent the hunter wanted her delivered in a specific condition. She had felt the careful handling, the precision of the restraint, the absence of anything that seemed designed to hurt. They wanted something from her, something specific. And beneath all of this, beneath the assessment, beneath the careful present moment attention, beneath everything she was doing to stay functional, there was a pressure in her chest that had nothing to do with any of it. Not fear of the man who had taken her, not fear of what was coming. Something older, something that had been building for 3 weeks in Greenhouse 6, in the soil beside a specimen whose resonance she had not been able to name. The pressure felt like arrival, like something at a very great distance had been waiting for her for a very long time, and the distance was now decreasing. She did not know what was at the other end of it. She sat in the cold hold and breathed steadily and let the hyperspace tunnel outside the hull do what hyperspace tunnels did. Carry her somewhere she had not chosen, at a speed that made the choice irrelevant. On Ragmar V, the station was dark and silent. In Greenhouse 6, the Murakami specimen sat in its growing bed. Its force signature was unchanged, steady, present, generating the faint resonance that Hestizo had spent 3 weeks trying to interpret. The direction of that resonance, north-northwest by the station's compass, pointed toward a frozen dead world in the outer rim. The greenhouses stayed warm. The monitoring systems ran their automated cycles. No one was there to read them. Rojo Trace's scheduled rotation would bring him to this region in 11 days. 11 days was a long time. The ship touched down at the 3rd hour of the morning, when the academy was fully dark, and the ice fields beyond the perimeter wall reflected nothing because there was nothing to reflect. Scabrous was at the landing pad. He watched Tulk bring her down the ramp. The binders, the careful handling, the professional economy of a hunter who had done the job correctly and wanted that recognized. Hestizo Trace was smaller than her core file had suggested. Or perhaps that was the cold, the way the frozen world reduced everything to its essential dimensions. She was not struggling. She was watching, her eyes moving across the academy's outer structures with the particular quality of someone cataloging information rather than reacting to it. Scabrous noted this. He paid Tulk through the pre-arranged transfer and dismissed him with the minimum words the transaction required. Tulk left without asking questions. That was what the contract price bought. Competence and the absence of curiosity. He turned to Hestizo. She looked at him directly. Most people, brought to this world in binders at the third hour, looked at the ground or at the restraints, or at the structures around them, anywhere except the person who had arranged their presence here. She looked at him. He said, "You will not be harmed if the work proceeds correctly." She said nothing. He brought her inside. The cell adjacent to the temple chamber had been prepared for 3 weeks. Not a punishment cell. The academy had those, and they were built accordingly. Stone and durasteel, and the specific architecture of spaces designed to break the occupant's resistance. This was different. Scabrous had constructed it with the same care he had applied to the ritual space itself. Temperature regulated, air quality maintained, a sleeping surface, adequate light, a water supply that was not connected to the academy's general system, because the general system was dosed, and she needed to remain undosed until the ritual's final preparation stage. She needed to be intact, exactly as intact as she was right now. He showed her the space without explaining it. Explanation was not necessary at this stage. What was necessary was that she understood her physical situation accurately, which she appeared to. She assessed the cell with the same cataloguing attention she had applied to the outer structures, and he saw her register the care in its construction. And he saw her understand from that care that her immediate physical safety was genuinely not under threat. Understanding your situation accurately was more useful than false comfort. He left her there and went to the ritual space. He ran the attunement instruments first. The array he had built over 5 years of temple preparation. A set of modified force resonance sensors, positioned at calculated intervals around the housing's plinth, had been running on passive monitoring since the housing arrived. They had recorded the chamber's baseline resonance across 5 years. The alchemical compounds in the walls, the preparation markings on the floor, the housing itself sitting at the center of it all, generating its steady, deep, sealed signature. Tonight, the instruments showed something different. Not dramatically different, not in a way that would have been legible to anyone who had not spent 5 years building a precise picture of what the baseline looked like. But the central reading, the housing's own signature, monitored continuously, had shifted. A small rotation in its resonance vector, the directional component of the signature, which for 5 years had pointed in no particular direction, now had a consistent orientation. It was pointing toward the cell. Scabrous stood at the instrument array for a long time, reading the data across multiple output formats, confirming from every angle that what he was seeing was what he was seeing. The plant inside the sealed housing had rotated on its stem. The bloom face was oriented toward where Hestizo Trace was sleeping. He had believed this would happen. He had designed everything around the belief that it would happen. But belief and confirmation were different things, and the instruments in front of him were confirmation. Clean, unambiguous, exactly matching the behavior Dria's holocron had described for a caretaker of the correct attunement profile encountering the specimen for the first time. Everything Dria had recorded was accurate. Every calculation Scabrous had built from that record was correct. He made a note in the ritual log. Then he began the first preparation stage. Day 1 was biological, the final concentrated dose of the preparation compound, different from the diluted water supply distribution. A direct administration that would bring Hestizo's system to the full receptivity level the ritual required. Needed 48 hours to integrate before the bloom trigger could be attempted. Scabrous had built this window into the timeline from the beginning. He administered the compound in the morning, with the same clinical precision He applied to every procedural element. She asked what it was. He told her, a biological preparation required for the process. Non-harmful at this concentration in a healthy subject, she asked. Required for what process? He told her that too. Not everything, not the formula's full complexity, but the relevant facts. The plant, the bloom, what the bloom compound, received in a properly prepared body, would accomplish. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "And if I don't cooperate?" He said, "The preparation does not require your cooperation. The bloom trigger does. We will address that when we reach it." He left her with food, water from the uncontaminated supply, and a lamp at the setting she would need for a 2-day integration period. He went upstairs. Day 2 was the academy. The institution above the temple had no knowledge of what was happening below it. The students attended training sessions. The instructors ran assessments. The dining hall served meals from the kitchen that drew from the water supply that had been carrying the preparation compound in low concentrations for 4 years. The academy's population was, by Scabrous's calculation, at 91% preparation saturation. 4 years of continuous low-dose exposure had built the compound to near full integration in most subjects. The remaining 9% represented natural biological variation, the outer edge of the distribution, subjects whose metabolism processed the compound more slowly. He had calculated this population as a buffer. The ritual's central process did not require the surrounding population to be prepared. That was the secondary application he had developed beyond Dreer's framework, the amplification effect, that the prepared bodies in proximity would contribute to the bloom compound's reach. They were enhancement, not requirement. He reviewed the day's academy reports with the same attention he had given them for 15 years. Nothing in the reports that required his direct involvement. Nothing in the population's behavior that suggested the preparation compound was producing observable effects at current concentration levels. The institution functioned. He returned to the temple in the evening. Hestizo was awake. She had not tried to leave. The cell's construction made that impractical, and she had the intelligence not to spend energy on impractical attempts. She was sitting with her back against the far wall, and when he entered, she was not startled, which meant she had heard him coming down the passage and had time to compose herself, which meant her force attunement was functioning, despite the preparation compound's early stage effects. This was expected. The compound suppressed nothing at this stage. It was building, not limiting. He checked her vital readings. The integration was proceeding correctly. He said nothing that was not procedurally necessary. She said, as he was leaving, the plant moved. He stopped, she said. "I felt it last night. After you left, the direction changed." He turned. She was looking at the wall that separated the cell from the ritual chamber, the wall behind which the housing sat on its plinth, with the focused, still expression he had seen in greenhouse specialists in the agricultural core files. The expression of someone listening through a medium that was not sound. He said, "Describe what you felt." She described it with precision. The shift in the living signature through the sealed container, the bloom face's orientation change, the quality of the plant's force presence, now that it had reoriented toward her. The description matched his instrument readings exactly. He noted this in the ritual log. He left without responding to it further. Day 3 brought the first anomaly. The morning academy report, which reached him through the standard administrative channel, contained an item flagged by the medical station attendant. A student in the second-year cohort presenting with symptoms consistent with a severe febrile response. The attendant had logged it as a potential infectious illness and had isolated the student in the medical station pending assessment. Scabrous read the symptom description. He read it again. Then he went to the medical station. The student was a 17-year-old female in the second cohort, not one he had specifically monitored. sitting in the middle of his preparation saturation distribution by every metric he had recorded. She should have been at 91% saturation, like the majority of the population. Her symptoms should not have been visible at current concentration levels. He examined her directly, with the thoroughness that the medical station's instruments could not replicate. What he found was not a febrile response. What he found was the sickness at early stage. The specific cellular signature he had documented across the tower's research sessions. The pathogen active in a body that should not have activated it, because the current water supply concentration was well below the threshold at which the pathogen could become active in an uncompromised preparation compound environment. He stood beside the student's medical station bed and ran the calculation again in his head. The number he arrived at was not the number he expected. He went to the tower. He pulled the water supply dosage records. Every entry, from the initial introduction 4 years ago through the most recent weekly calibration, 18 months of data that he had reviewed and confirmed and filed as correct at the time of each entry. He found the error in the 43rd week, a transcription mistake, a decimal placement in a weekly dosage calculation that had introduced a concentration level 14% higher than the target for a 6-week period before the error propagated through the calibration system and self-corrected. He had not caught it at the time. The 6-week window had occurred during a period of intensive formula work that had occupied his primary attention, and the water supply monitoring had been running on the automated checks rather than his direct review. 14% above target for 6 weeks had pushed a segment of the population, those whose metabolism processed the compound at the faster end of the distribution, past the threshold at which the compound's interaction with the sickness changed from protective to activating. Not the full population, a segment. His calculations suggested between 8 and 15 individuals, depending on individual metabolic variation. The student in the medical station was the first to show visible symptoms. She was not the only one at risk. He returned to the medical station. He transferred the student to the tower's isolation room, the same room that had held the research subjects over the past 5 years, built for exactly this kind of containment, with the protocols already established and the equipment already in place. He told the medical attendant that the student was being transferred for specialized assessment. He told the attendant that the medical station should flag any similar presentations immediately. He returned to the tower. He sat at the desk and ran the full population analysis. Every student, every instructor, every support staff member, against the corrected dosage curve, identifying every individual in the at-risk segment, 14 names. He quarantined 14 people across the following 4 hours, distributed through the academy's dormitories and workspaces. Each removal handled through the administrative authority that 15 years of institutional leadership had made routine. A student transferred to medical observation. An instructor reassigned to tower-adjacent duties. Each removal processed through a different administrative category, none of them appearing in the same report. He did not stop the ritual. He adjusted the timeline. The 48-hour integration window he had planned for Hestizo's preparation was already running. The bloom trigger had been scheduled for day 3 of the 8-day window. He moved it to day 2, compressing the preparation stage to the minimum viable window, sacrificing the additional safety margin he had built in for caution's sake. Caution was a resource. He had just spent some of it. He still had enough. Day 4 began before dawn. Scabrous descended to the temple at the 2nd hour, ran the instrument array, confirmed Hestizo's preparation readings through the cell wall. The compound integration had reached the necessary threshold despite the compressed timeline, the biological priming complete, and made the entries in the ritual log. The housing signature on the instruments had not changed since day 1. The Bloom face remained oriented toward the cell. He stood in front of the plinth and looked at the housing for a moment. The darkened transparent steel, the inscription facing outward, the burn marks against the wall, and then turned to the cell entrance. What happened next was the first stage of the Bloom trigger sequence. The specific force channeling procedure that Dria's formula required to initiate the plant's opening cycle. Scabrous had rehearsed this sequence more times than he could count. Run it in every simulation his preparation work had produced. Confirmed its parameters against the inscription and the transmission, until every element was exact, he began. Hestizo felt it immediately. He saw this in her. Not panic, not resistance, but the visible response of a force sensitive, with deep attunement encountering a significant dark side application in close proximity. She went still in the way of someone whose senses were suddenly overwhelmed with input, her attention snapping toward the housing, with an intensity that his instruments registered as a spike in the room's attunement field. The housing signature shifted. The Bloom face's orientation strengthened, the resonance vector sharpening from the diffuse warmth of day one to something more focused, more present. The plant responding to both the dark side application and the attuned force sensitive simultaneously. The two elements it had been engineered to respond to, arriving at the same time in the same space. He continued the sequence. The instruments climbed. At the 19th hour of day 4, he was at the instrument array when the sound reached him. Faint, distance filtered through 40 meters of rock, and the sub-basement archive above, and the Academy's stone floors above that. Not identifiable as a specific sound at this range, more a quality. Something in the building's acoustic signature that had not been there yesterday. He finished the entry he was making in the ritual log. He capped his stylus. He went up. The Academy's main corridor was lit at its standard night setting. Low, even, the lamps burning at 30% along the ceiling, the stone floor empty. The building was in its settled night pattern. The population in dormitories. The scheduled quiet of an institution that ran on structured time, except the corridor was not entirely quiet. From the east dormitory, a sound, not loud enough to characterize from this distance. From the training hall, accessed through the corridor's far end, a different sound. Lower, more irregular, from somewhere below the main building's ground level. The maintenance sub-corridors, the utility spaces under the kitchen. A third sound, different again in quality from the first two, with a character that he recognized before he consciously identified it. He stood in the corridor and listened to all three simultaneously. He had 14 people in quarantine. The sounds were coming from at least 3 locations that were not the quarantine spaces. He ran the calculation one more time, faster than he had run it before. Adjusting for the variables, the corridor's acoustic information had just added. The error in week 43 had not affected 14 people. The error in week 43 had affected more. He stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he turned and walked back to the passage behind the archive shelving. He descended to the temple. He did not stop the ritual. By the morning of day 5, the Eastern dormitory had 17 people who were no longer people in any functional sense. Scabrous knew the number because he had counted them, not in person, from the tower's monitoring system, the acoustic sensors, and the force resonance array he had installed across the Academy's structure in his 3rd year, originally designed to track preparation, compound, distribution through the population. The system had not been built for this purpose. It served it adequately. The resonance signature of the sickness's late-stage progression was distinct from living force presence in a way the instruments could detect and quantify, and he had spent day 4 recalibrating the array to distinguish between the two states. 17 in the Eastern dormitory, 4 in the Western, 2 in the instructor's quarters, an indeterminate number in the maintenance sub-corridors below the kitchen, where the acoustic return was too complex for precise counting. He noted the figures in his monitoring log, calculated the progression rate against his existing models, and identified the variance. The sickness was moving through the prepared population at a speed 38% faster than the model predicted for the corrected dosage curve. He ran the calculation 3 times. The number did not change. He noted the variance, flagged it for analysis, and went back down to the temple. The academy above him was not his primary concern. This required stating clearly, not as moral position, not as the declaration of a man who had stopped caring, but as operational fact. The ritual was at a stage where interruption would cost more than continuation. The Bloom trigger sequence had been running for 36 hours. The housing was open. He had broken the seal on day 4's second session. The transparasteel panel removed and set aside. The interior of the container exposed to the temple's air for the first time since Drea had sealed it 5 centuries ago. The orchid was visible. He had seen it for the first time in that moment, had stood in front of the open housing, and looked at what 40 years of Drea's careful cultivation had produced, what 5 centuries of stasis had preserved. The petals were black, genuinely black, not dark-colored, but the specific absence of light that the old Sith designation had described as deep space with no stars. The stem was thin and precise. The root system, visible at the base of the sealed growing medium, Drea had packed into the container's lower chamber, showed no sign of 5 centuries of suspended animation. It looked as alive as anything in Hestizo's greenhouse had looked when she described it. It had been alive the entire time. The stasis had been that good. He had stood looking at it for a moment, one scientist encountering the work of another. 5 centuries collapsed into a single point of recognition, and then he had continued the sequence. Hestizo's attunement to the specimen was the variable he had calculated most carefully and trusted most completely. What he had not fully calculated was the quality of that attunement in active expression. The difference between the passive listening he had profiled from the agricultural core records and what it looked like when Hestizo Trace was actually present with a living force reactive specimen that was responding to her. It was not what the files had suggested. The files had described a skilled practitioner with above-average botanical attunement. What he was observing through the ritual space's instruments was a practitioner whose relationship with the living force, in the presence of this specific specimen, produced a resonance quality he did not have precise language for in his existing framework. The instruments were measuring something they were not designed to measure. The orchid was not simply responding to her presence. It was reaching. The stem had oriented. The petals were tracking. Minute movements, fraction of degree adjustments, following the directional quality of her attunement, the way a plant tracks light. The Bloom compound instruments registered a building pressure in the sealed growing medium beneath the root system, the compound accumulating toward release at a rate consistent with full bloom progression. Everything was working. Above him, the academy was dying. He continued the sequence. Day 5 brought Lusk to the tower door. Not in the night, in the mid-morning, when the academy's scheduled activities had dissolved into something that was no longer schedulable. The surviving population moving through the buildings in configurations that had nothing to do with training sessions or assessment periods, or any of the structures that had organized their existence for years. Lusk knocked. Scabrous opened the door. Lusk was intact, physically unaffected, which placed him in the segment of the population whose metabolic profile had not been pushed past the activation threshold by the week 43 dosage error. He was also, visibly, operating under significant stress. The controlled expression he had maintained through 3 years of private instruction sessions, showing its first genuine fractures. He said, "The academy is gone," Scabrous said. "Not entirely." Lusk said, "What is happening?" This was the moment the private instruction sessions had been building toward. Not this specific conversation, but this specific type of moment. High stress, incomplete information. The subject seeking direction from the embedded command structure below his conscious awareness. Scabrous applied the activation sequence, not dramatically, not with visible force application. Just 3 specific words in a specific order that the sessions had established as the trigger. Lusk's expression changed. The fractures closed. The stress did not disappear. It was still there, readable in his physiology. But it reorganized itself around a different center. The contingency protocols engaging in the way they had been built to engage. Below the level where Lusk could examine them, Scabrous gave him 3 instructions. Lusk received them without questioning. He left. Day 6 was the Academy's last functional day. Not because the outbreak completed its process on day 6. That would take longer. The sickness's progression having its own timeline that Scabrous had documented extensively. Day 6 was the last day, because on day 6, the remaining unaffected population made the collective, wordless decision that the structures holding them here had ceased to function as structures, and that the ice fields beyond the perimeter wall, cold as they were, represented a better probability of survival than the buildings. They left in groups mostly, some alone. The landing pad had 1 ship. Tulk had taken his when he departed, and the Academy's own transport was a crawler that moved across the ice fields at a pace that made it useful for short-range supply runs, and nothing else. The people who left on day 6 left on foot, across ice, in the cold, in whatever they had been wearing when they decided to go. Scabrous watched this from the tower window between sessions, not with anything that resembled response. He watched it the way he watched the courtyard's evening patterns, as information registered and filed, relevant to the operational picture and not to anything else. Rojo Trace landed on day 6. He came in a 1-person scout ship, fast and unannounced, setting down on the pad while 2 of the Academy's surviving students were attempting to access the crawler bay adjacent to it. He had his lightsaber and the particular expression of someone who had been moving toward a specific destination with maximum urgency for 11 days, and had arrived to find that urgency was not sufficient. He had found the station on Ragmar Fev empty, the greenhouse with the struggle evidence, the disrupted soil beside the Murakami bed, the monitoring systems still running their automated cycles over specimens that had no one to read them. He had spent 3 days following the acquisition trail through intermediary channels that a Jedi Guardian with sufficient motivation and the right connections could access. And the trail had ended at this world, at this academy, at a name he had then spent 6 days researching. Darth Scabrous. He knew enough. Not everything. Not the formula. Not the ritual's specific requirements. Not the underground temple. But enough to know that his sister had been brought here for a purpose. That the purpose involved something she could do that no one else could. And that the academy he had landed in the middle of was not functioning in any way that resembled normal institutional operation. He moved through the outer buildings with the trained efficiency of a guardian who had done threat environment navigation before. Lightsaber not yet active, keeping to the walls, reading the space ahead before committing to it. The eastern dormitory was a sound he did not investigate directly. The training hall was worse. He kept moving. He was looking for the tower. In the temple, Day 6's second session was running. The Bloom trigger sequence had reached its 3rd phase. The stage Dria's inscription, described as the final approach. The specific force channeling application that, sustained at the correct intensity, would bring the compound accumulation in the growing medium to full release pressure. Hestizo was not cooperating. This was the complication he had identified on day 4 and had been managing since. Not active resistance, because active resistance would have been simpler to address. Passive withdrawal. She was present in the ritual space, physically positioned as required. The preparation compound fully integrated in her system. Her attunement to the specimen undeniable and continuous, and precisely what the ritual needed. But she was not giving it to the ritual. She was holding it back, not withholding her attunement from the orchid, because the attunement was not something she could simply switch off, but applying it in a way that had kept the specimen at the threshold of full response without crossing it. A practitioner skilled enough to feel exactly where the line was and remain precisely at it. He had not calculated for this level of precision in a resistant subject. He applied additional pressure through the trigger sequence. The instruments climbed, the petals moved, fractionally, incrementally, the bloom progression advancing in small steps, and then pausing as she adjusted. The two of them locked in a sustained contest that his instruments were rendering as a wavering line on the resonance output that had been flatly upward in every simulation he had run. The line was not flat. He increased the pressure again. Day 7 arrived in the specific way that days arrived on Odyssey Faustin. Without announcement, the sky outside shifting from one shade of grey to another. The ice fields unchanging, the cold consistent. The Academy's sounds had changed again, not louder, in some ways quieter, because the population generating the sounds had decreased. As Day 6's departures removed the unaffected survivors from the buildings, what remained was a different quality, more uniform, less varied, the acoustic signature of a space where one kind of presence had largely replaced another. Scabrous had stopped going upstairs to assess. The instruments provided adequate information, and the time spent ascending and descending was time not spent on the sequence. The sequence was everything now. He had run his models on Day 6 and identified the window. The ritual needed to complete before the sickness's progression reached the temple level of the building, which his calculations placed at approximately 36 hours from the current moment. The underground space's isolation would delay it. The stone, the depth, the lack of direct connection to the Academy's main ventilation, but not indefinitely. 36 hours. The bloom trigger's third phase, at current progress rate, required approximately 18 hours to complete. 18 hours inside a 36-hour window. Sufficient margin, if the subject's resistance could be overcome. He sat with this calculation for 1 minute. Then he returned to the sequence with an application intensity he had been reserving, a level he had classified in his preparation notes as maximum sustainable, the threshold above which the forced channeling required recovery time he could not afford to spend. He had been below that threshold since Day 1. He crossed it. The instruments responded. The resonance output's wavering line straightened, not because Hestizo's resistance had stopped, but because the intensity of the trigger application had pushed the specimen's response past the point where her threshold management could hold it. The orchid was not waiting for her permission. It was responding to the combined force environment of the ritual space. Her attunement, his application, the alchemical markings on the floor, the centuries of accumulated resonance in the chamber walls, everything converging at the specimen simultaneously. The bloom compound pressure reached 91%. Scabrous watched the instrument output. The petals opened, not fully, not in the single fluid movement that full bloom produced in the simulations. In increments, the black petals unfurling degree by degree, the compound pressure climbing with each increment, the release threshold approaching with the specific quality of something that had been building for a very long time, finally arriving at its destination. 91, 92. The air in the chamber changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but perceptibly, a quality entering it that had not been there before. The bloom compound, beginning its release at the lower threshold, the scent of something that had no comparison in any sensory catalogue he had encountered, reaching him across the ritual space. 92.5. He was at the instrument array. Hestizo was 2 meters from the open housing. The petals were 3 centimeters extended. Then, 4, the black unfurling toward the open air of the chamber. For the first time in 500 years, he was 41 hours from the completion of 20 years of work. The petals stopped, not slowed, not hesitated, stopped. A clean, complete cessation of movement. The bloom progression arresting at 4 centimeters extended. The compound pressure reading, holding at 92.7 and not climbing. He looked at Hestizo. She was not moving. She was standing exactly where she had been standing, physically unchanged. Her eyes open and focused on the housing, but she had done something. Not in the physical space, in the force. A withdrawal, precise and deliberate, pulling her attunement back from the specimen's reaching response, with a control that should not have been possible under the current trigger intensity, not breaking the attunement, not severing the connection, pulling it back to exactly the point where the specimen's response had been sustained, but not advancing. The same threshold management she had been applying since day 4, applied now at maximum trigger intensity, with the bloom at 4 centimeters and the compound at 92.7. She had found the line even here. The instruments held their reading. The petals did not move. Scabrous looked at her. 15 years of preparation, 20 years since the holocron, 5 centuries since Drea sealed the housing and descended to the vault and sat down on the stone floor and did not leave. And a young woman from a remote agricultural station, with her hands at her sides and her eyes on the open housing, had found the precise point of resistance that all of it could not push past. He stood in the silence of the chamber. The instruments held. The petals held. This was the first moment in 15 years of preparation that something had done exactly what he had not calculated for. He stood with that fact for 3 seconds. Then he began calculating. Rojo found the passage entrance at the 2nd hour of day 8, not through any intelligence Scabrous had failed to conceal. The passage behind the archive shelving had no visible marker, no architectural feature that distinguished it from the surrounding wall, nothing that would have identified it to a search. Rojo found it the way Force sensitives found things that were hidden but not sealed against the Force. By following what the space around him was doing, the way certain volumes of air moved differently near an opening, the way the stone's resonance shifted at the boundary between solid rock and hollow descent. He had been in the sub-basement archive for 40 minutes. He had moved through the Academy's upper structure across 3 days, avoiding the infected, staying in the building's unaffected zones, working methodically toward the tower while the institution around him completed its collapse. He had not found the tower accessible. The sickness's progression had moved through the corridors adjacent to it on day 6, and the approach required passing through spaces he could not pass through without engagement. An engagement with what those spaces now contained was not something he had been willing to attempt alone when his objective was not engagement, but location. He had pulled back. He had spent a day mapping the building's lower levels, where the sickness had not yet fully reached, looking for an alternative approach. The archive's hollow floor had answered. He came down the passage with his lightsaber lit. The blue blade was not tactical. The passage was narrow enough that swinging it was not possible. And whatever was at the bottom was not something a lightsaber could address through the 40 meters of descent. He lit it for light. The passage was completely dark, and the descent was steep enough that moving in total darkness without force-guided navigation was impractical. The light moved ahead of him on the stone walls. He felt the chamber before he reached it. The resonance density that had accumulated over centuries in the alchemical sealed space. The force weight of everything that had happened here in the past 7 days, and something else underneath all of it, something alive and specific and reaching, that he recognized immediately as botanical, even though nothing in his training had prepared him for encountering it 40 meters underground. He stepped through the entrance. Scabrous was at the instrument array. He turned when Rojo entered, not quickly, not with the reflexive urgency of someone surprised. The turn had the quality of someone who had calculated the probability of this arrival and had placed it in the expected range. He looked at Rojo with the same assessment he applied to everything, taking the information in, filing it, determining its relevance to the current operational situation. Rojo looked at him and understood immediately that something was wrong, not with the situation, with Scabrous himself. The man standing at the instrument array was not the man described in the records. Rojo had assembled across 6 days of research, the precise, controlled alchemist headmaster, whose reputation in imperial circles emphasized detachment and methodical intelligence. This man had that intelligence still. It was visible in his eyes, in the quality of his attention, but it was sharing space with something else. A slight wrongness in the skin's color, a marginally elevated stillness in the way he held himself, a quality in his eyes that Rojo had seen in the Academy's infected population and had learned to read as the sickness's early neurological signature. Scabrous had been in the contaminated building for 7 days. He had not been untouched by it. He had simply continued working. Hestizo was against the far wall of the ritual space, 12 meters from the open housing on its plinth. She was intact. Rojo read this in the first 2 seconds. The systematic damage assessment that years of Guardian training had made automatic. Intact. Alert. The preparation compound's effects, visible in her physiology to someone who knew what to look for, but not debilitating. She saw him. She said his name. He said, "I'm here. Stay there," she said. "Rojo," he said, "stay there." He moved into the chamber fully, lightsaber held at the ready position, his attention on Scabrous, his peripheral awareness tracking the space. The instrument array, the marked floor, the housing on the plinth, the orchid inside it with its petals 4 centimeters, extended and motionless. Scabrous said, "You are not the variable I was expecting today," Rojo said. "Where I am is exactly where you should have expected me." Scabrous said nothing for a moment. Then he said, 8 days. She arrived 8 days ago. You tracked her in 8 days. Not a question. A data point, registered and filed. He reached toward the instrument array without taking his eyes off Rojo and made a single adjustment to the trigger sequence controls. The chamber's resonance shifted. The fight was not clean. Rojo had trained for 15 years. He was a guardian. Combat was the primary expression of his relationship with the Force, the channel through which his attunement moved most naturally. And he was good at it in the specific way that people who have spent 15 years doing one thing with full commitment become good at it. Scabrous had not trained for combat in the conventional sense. What he had was worse. The sickness's early-stage neurological effects, the same effects Rojo had observed in the Academy's infected population during his 3 days of movement through the building, did not simply degrade the host. In the early stage, before the degradation became total, they reconfigured. The pathogen's interaction with the central nervous system produced a period of altered physiology. Pain response suppressed, fatigue response suppressed. The body's normal limiting signals going quiet, while the underlying muscle and force application capacity ran unchecked. Scabrous was faster than he should have been, stronger than his frame suggested, and the intelligence behind his eyes diminished. Yes, the sickness working on it, degree by degree, as the fight progressed, was still present enough to be directing what the reconfigured body was doing with the precision of someone who had spent 20 years studying exactly how biological systems worked and failed. He had a Sith sword and a lightsaber. Both blades moved with the specific economy of someone who was not fighting to win in the conventional sense, but to sustain, to keep the ritual sequence running, to keep Hestizo in the ritual space, to prevent Rojo from reaching the controls. Rojo was fighting to create an opening, not for himself. Hestizo understood this before Rojo made it explicit. She had spent 7 days in this chamber with the housing, with the orchid, with the quality of presence the specimen generated in its partially extended state. She had spent 7 days feeling exactly where the bloom threshold was and holding herself at its edge. A sustained act of precision that had required everything she had, every hour of every day, the passive attunement she had developed across years of agricultural work, deployed at its maximum capacity to maintain a single fixed point of resistance. She was exhausted in a way that had no physical expression. She watched her brother fight a man who was becoming something other than a man as the fight progressed. The sickness's advancement visible in real time, the skin's color deepening toward the specific gray-yellow she had seen in the bodies on the upper floors, the eyes' clarity reducing, the intelligence behind them contracting, and she understood the geometry of what was happening. Rojo could not win this, not because he was outmatched. The fight was close, the outcome genuinely uncertain in the mechanical sense. But winning the fight required killing Scabrous, and killing Scabrous required time that the sickness was not going to give him. The pathogen's progression, at the stage she could observe in Scabrous's physiology, was running faster than the fight. Scabrous was going to become something that could not be killed by a lightsaber in the time Rojo had available. She looked at the housing. The petals were 4 centimeters extended. She looked at them for a long moment, at the black surfaces, at the compound she could feel building behind them, at the specific biological architecture of what Drea had built, and Scabrous had spent 20 years trying to complete. She understood something. Drea had designed the specimen to bloom, to release its compound in a single full opening, the petals drawing back completely, the contents of the growing medium-sealed reservoir releasing into the surrounding air in a diffuse cloud that would settle on the prepared body of the ritual subject and be absorbed. A bloom was a broadcast. It went everywhere. But a bloom was not the only thing the specimen's biology could do. She had spent 7 years working with force-reactive botanical specimens. She had spent those years specifically in the passive, receptive attunement that agricultural specialists developed, learning to feel what a living system was doing, what it was capable of, what it was built for at the level beneath its designed function. The orchid's root system had a directional capacity. She had felt it across 7 days. The way the specimen's force response was not simply outward but oriented, tracking her position, moving its bloom face toward her with the same directed attention that sunflowers tracked light. The direction was not incidental. It was biological, a feature of the Murakami subspecies attunement to force-sensitive presence. The plant's mechanism for ensuring the bloom compound reached the specific attuned individual rather than dispersing uselessly. She could use that direction, not to bloom, to expel. She did not think about Rojo while she was doing it. This was not coldness. It was the same quality she brought to everything she did with the specimens, the complete, undivided, present moment attention that the work required, the capacity to be fully here and not anywhere else. She had learned it in a greenhouse on a quiet world. She was using it here now, in a stone chamber 40 meters underground, while her brother fought a dying man to give her the time she needed. She opened her attunement completely, not the controlled, threshold-managed opening she had maintained across 7 days of resistance. The full opening, the deepest receptive state she could reach, everything she had given to the work across 7 years directed at this single specimen in this single moment. The orchid reached back, She felt the root system's full capacity in an instant. The directional mechanism, the compound reservoir, the biological architecture that Drea had spent 40 years building into it. She felt the compound behind the petals at its current pressure, 92.7, the number Scabrous's instruments had been reading for over a day. She pushed the direction, not outward, not in the broadcast that a bloom would have produced. At him, the expulsion was not a bloom. The petals did not open further. They contracted, slightly, fractionally, the biological reverse of the opening motion, the root system's directional capacity engaging at maximum, the compound reservoir releasing not in the diffuse cloud of a full opening, but in a concentrated directional burst, a biological projectile with no physical mass but complete force resonance, aimed at the specific living presence she had oriented it toward. It crossed the chamber in less than a second. Scabrous felt it. She saw this, saw the moment it reached him, the specific instant when the compound entered his system through the direct force contact that the Murakami subspecies directed mechanism produced. He stopped moving, not completely, not all at once, but the quality of his motion changed in that instant. The fight's rhythm breaking at its center. Rojo felt the change before he understood it. He pressed forward. What happened to Scabrous was not the immortality formula completing. It was the sickness activating. The compound at 92.7%, below the neutralization threshold by 0.3%, had entered a body already carrying the pathogen at early stage progression. The compound in partial concentration did not neutralize what was already present. It accelerated it. Drea had documented this possibility in the materials Scabrous had spent 15 years studying. It was in the transmission. It was in the inscription. It was the reason the threshold was 93%. Scabrous had calculated the threshold correctly. He had not calculated for the expulsion. He did not fall immediately. The degradation was rapid, but not instantaneous. The pathogen's acceleration moving through a body that had already been compromised by 7 days of early-stage exposure. The two processes combining in the specific way that Scabrous had documented across years of research subjects. The stages progressing in the order he had recorded them, with the clarity that early-stage subjects had before the neurological effects advanced past coherent function. He understood what had happened. She saw this in him, saw the comprehension arrive, precise and complete, in the seconds before the advancing degradation reached the part of him that could comprehend things. The intelligence in his eyes registered it with the same dispassionate recognition he had brought to every other piece of information in 20 years of work. A miscalculated variable, not the threshold, not the formula, the subject. He had not calculated for what she could do. Rojo's blade finished what the expulsion had started. The chamber was very quiet. Hestizo sat on the stone floor, not from injury, not from a decision. Her legs had simply stopped sustaining her weight at some point in the seconds after it ended, and the floor was where she was. Her brother was beside her. Not for long. She understood this, felt it through her attunement in a way she did not choose to examine directly. What the fight had cost Rojo was not visible in any external damage, but she felt the quality of his force presence, and she felt what was in it, and she knew. He sat next to her with his back against the chamber wall. He did not say anything about himself. He said, "Are you hurt?" She said no. He said, "The plant." She looked at the housing. The orchid was visible. Petals contracted now, back below 4 centimeters. The expulsion having reversed the bloom progression to something below the day 7 measurement. Not closed, not open. Suspended at a position that had no name in any botanical protocol she knew. She said, "It's alive." He said, "Good." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I found the greenhouse, the big one." The orchid in the second bed was still running its cycle. She said, "Greenhouse 6. He said, "It was doing something, pointing." She said, "I know." He said, "I followed it here." She said nothing. He put his hand on her shoulder, briefly, the specific pressure of someone communicating something they do not have words for, and have stopped trying to find words for. Then he was gone. She did not know how long she sat there. The chamber's cold worked through the stone floor into her bones, the way Odessa Forstin's cold worked through everything, completely, without urgency, with the patience of a temperature that had been this way for longer than any record reached. The alchemical compounds in the walls held the space at the resonance density she had felt since the first moment she entered it. The instruments at the array had gone to their standby state, the screens dim, the readings frozen at whatever values they had held when Scabrous last touched them. The housing was on the floor of the ritual space. Scabrous had moved it from the plinth during Day 7's preparation, positioned it at standing height on a support frame, angled toward where she had been standing. It had stayed there through everything. She stood. She crossed to it. The orchid inside was visible, petals at their partial extension, stem oriented toward where she stood now, because she was standing in approximately the position she had occupied throughout the ritual. The root system was intact. The growing medium was undisturbed. The specimen was alive, functioning. The passive force signature she had been reading for 8 days, still present and clear. She picked up the housing. She carried it to the plinth. She set it in the depression, the base ring's edges meeting the carved stone with the same precision she had watched Scabrous describe in his records. The fit exact, the inscription facing outward. She stepped back. She did not make a decision to leave the housing here. She simply understood, in the way she understood things through the attunement, rather than through reasoning, that the housing was where it was, and that she was not the person who should carry it away from this place. She did not know who was. She only knew she was not. The passage back to the archive was 40 meters of cold stone and climbing. She went up it without looking back. At the top, the archive shelving was where it had been. The same ordered rows, the same preservation containers on the same shelves. Thomas Henn's careful maintenance visible in the dust-free surfaces that no one had disturbed because no one had been down here since the outbreak began. She moved through the archive. She moved through the academy above it. She did not look at what the buildings contained now. She kept her attunement pulled in, not closed, because she could not close it, but directed inward, away from the things the academy's spaces were registering in the force. There were some things that the passive receptive attunement was not suited to receive. She found the landing pad. Tulk's ship was gone. Rojo's scout ship was on the pad, small, one-person fueled. She stood looking at it for a moment. Then she got in. The pad fell away below her. The frozen world fell away below that. She did not look at the academy as she left the atmosphere. She looked forward, at the hyperspace coordinates she was calculating, at the distance between here and anywhere else. Behind her, the academy was silent on its ice field. Below the academy, in the stone temple that Drea had cut from the planet's own rock, the housing sat on its plinth in the dark. The inscription faced outward. The petals were where they had stopped. The orchid was alive. The cold held everything exactly where it was.